It was a hot summer day. Renee was 10, and the heir to Viscount Chambler arrived at Whitehall with his grandfather, a close friend of Renee's grandfather. Renee's grandfather introduced his granddaughter to the Viscount's father, and old friends invited their grandchildren to meet. Renee readily introduced herself to the cute boy. She said that her name was Renee Hazelin, and asked what the boy's name was. The boy replied that his name was Alexander Chambler, and that he was very pleased to meet Renee. The children were the same age and quickly found a common language. Their shared pranks amused those around them. From then on, every year, Alexander from Caliber came to Vayhall for the summer holidays. Renee willingly spent time with him in entertainment and fun, sharing her favorite toys, books, and funny stories. Alexander readily communicated with the cheerful girl. He was the ringleader and generator of new ideas in this tandem. After a tiring day, the children loved to sit on the beach, look at the wonderful moonlit path, and dream about the future. If the night was cool and Renee was freezing, she didn't have to worry about anything. Alexander was next to her. The boy, like a true gentleman, was always ready to give some of his clothes to his best friend so that she wouldn't freeze. For this, Renee was always grateful to Alexander. Increasingly, she looked at him not as a friend, but as a lover. Thanks to his sweet face and cheerful nature, Alexander became Renee's first love. The children's communication ended when they were both 16 years old, the year Alexander's mother, Blair Chambler, died. This news was shocking for Renee. She really wanted to support her friend in such a tragic situation. Renee sent several letters in an attempt to console Alexander, but strangely enough, the friend of childhood games did not answer her. In the winter, after learning about the fire at the Chambler estate, Renee decided to go to Calabar to visit Alexander. The girl was not even allowed onto the threshold of the magnificent house. The gatekeeper spoke to her through the bars of the gate. Renee was interested in whether everything was okay with Sasha and whether he had received her letters, and if so, why he hadn't answered any of them. The doorman replied that Monsieur Alexander was fine, but he did not want to see Madame Renee, at least not right now. The gatekeeper handed Renee an envelope with a note that Alexander had personally written for her. The girl immediately opened the envelope and hurried to read the message. Everything was written briefly and very clearly. Alexander wrote that he was tired of her, that she should never look for him again, and told Renee to get lost, and that's how it all ended. 8 years later, 18-year-old Renee Hazelin was forced to take charge of the vast family estate and became Baroness Hazelin. Now, Renee was a charming blonde, and the most important thing in her life was the orphanage organized in the barony. Renee personally raised the children and was often present in the dining room during her pupils' meals. And now she was trying to reconcile two naughty little girls and make them have a good breakfast before going to school. The children did not want to behave decently and again started a chase and an absolute mess within the confines of one cafeteria. Renee sternly reprimanded the pupils for inappropriate behavior, especially during meals. But it was all in vain. The pranksters not only didn't eat themselves, but also distracted the other children, chasing each other around the dining room, trying to find out some questions. The maid tried to help Renee control the naughty boys, but even this kind woman was unable to do anything. It is unknown how it would have all ended. But Renee had a brilliant idea and asked the children to listen to her. Renee declared that any child who did not finish the entire portion within 10 minutes and was late for school would not get apple pie tomorrow. This message had an effect. No one wanted to be left without a delicious holiday dessert. The girls immediately rushed to their tables. They needed to quickly eat their porridge and make it to the start of their first lesson. The boys stuffed the food into themselves indiscriminately and took turns reporting that they had eaten every last crumb. About 15 minutes later, the children left the cafeteria in a noisy crowd and hurried to classes, which were about to begin. Renee felt like a squeezed lemon. Every morning she walked into this dining room as if it were a battlefield. Today, she emerged victorious. 3 years ago, Baron Heiselin's estate was converted into an orphanage. After the death of her grandfather, Renee inherited the barony, both as a title and as an estate. The former head of the family died in the war, and the tragic death of her grandfather knocked Renee off track for a long time. To honor her grandfather's memory and to overcome her deep depression, Renee opened an orphanage on the Whitehall estate. An uncle who came to Renee's aid from the monastery advised her to take care of those who needed her help, so as not to fall into despondency and depression. The girl decided that the children who needed help the most were those orphaned during the war and who needed a roof over their heads. Renee could not turn a blind eye to the plight of children. After the war, many of them lost their normal lives. Renee herself lost her parents at a very young age, so she understood the feelings of orphans like no one else. The girl emerged from her depression, and the orphans felt at home on the estate. But Heiselin's financial situation left much to be desired. The girl was saddled with a multitude of unpaid bills, and the debt grew exponentially. The barony of Heiselin was on the brink of ruin and bankruptcy. Renee was angry, but she could do nothing about it. The source of these endless debts was actually a stupid uncle who was completely incapable of managing money. Once again, Edward Heiselin cried crocodile tears in his niece's office and asked her to forgive him for yet another unjustified expenditure. Renee listened to Edward express his regret that he had made a mistake and that he had been promised a 40% discount, but had in fact been deceived. Renee was outraged that her uncle was turning to the same supplier again and again, despite the fact that he was cheating him again and again. This is Bill from Bill & Sons, who for some reason always promises Edward a 40% discount, but never delivers it. As a result, they owe him for the desks. And yesterday, the uncle also bought slates from him and stepped on the same rake again. Renee couldn't understand why her uncle had bought and already paid for 200 boxes of chalk. The unpaid bills exceeded the annual budget of the entire mansion. Edward had nothing to say to his niece. He never thought that he would be able to harm her rather than help her. Uncle Edward was a good man, kind-hearted and innocent. He even wanted to get money by selling his fountain pens and clothes. The only problem was that Uncle Edward had absolutely no idea how this world worked. And unfortunately, Renee realized this too late. Just a couple of months ago, I had to sell some of my land to pay off taxes and debts. Renee thought that at this rate, they themselves would soon be thrown out onto the street. And then there would definitely be no time for maintaining the shelter. Renee decided to take action, but this required time. The girl ordered her uncle to calculate the total of all current payments. Renee promised to forgive him if he accurately calculated and wrote down who, where, and how much they owed. Edward did not expect such an order, but promised to carry it out. The monk was glad to somehow compensate for the damage caused by his vigorous activity as a supplier, and willingly took on the report. Seagulls screamed loudly over the sea. Vacationers liked them, but local residents treated them like thieves and beggars. Renee didn't feel any connection to anyone or anything right now. She just wanted thoughts about survival to stop bothering her. The ocean, so calm and powerful, splashed at the girl's very feet. It calmed and gave hope. When things were rough, Renee would come and look at the ocean. Everything had changed, but he was the only one who remained the same. When Renee sat on the ocean shore, she felt like she had returned to her carefree childhood, when her grandfather, mom, and dad were still alive. In that distant and cloudless childhood, when Alexander was nearby, it seemed to Renee that their friendship was growing into something deeper. It was hard not to believe it when Alexander's bottomless eyes looked at her with such anticipation and tenderness. The girl was scared, but she was ready to do anything stupid just to prolong these wonderful moments of random touches and fleeting glances. Renee shook herself and ordered herself to pull herself together. Now was not the time to relax and remember her first love. We have to think about the fact that there isn't a single coin to cover the shelter's expenses next month, and we need to come up with something to get some money. Out of the corner of her eye, Renee saw that she was no longer alone on the beach. Who could disturb her privacy? This place was known only to her. Renee had completely forgotten that there was another person who knew about this beach, and it was he who appeared now, in all his splendor. The last thing Renee expected was to see him. Or maybe it wasn't him at all, but a phantom evoked by the girl's memories. The man turned out to be quite real. He straightened his impeccable tie, smiled politely, and greeted Renee. To say that Renee was surprised is to say nothing. She least expected to see this person. The guy smiled as if there had been no 8 years of separation, and that disgusting letter. He only noted that he hadn't seen Renee for a long time. Renee thought the guy was nervous. The man said he knew the barony of Kaiserlil was in dire straits, so he thought that this was the best time to propose to Renee and whether she would like to marry him. The guy promised that Renee would not regret it if she agreed to make a deal with him. The details would be known only to the two of them. It was Alexander Chambler, head of the Chambler Marquisate and owner of the Chambler Corporation, the most powerful man in Caliba. Alexander inherited the title at the age of 17, and at 18 he went to war and served for 3 years, until its very end. Having heard about the island of shimmering stones, Alexander set out to search for it, and having endured many adventures, he found it. It was a real treasure. The diamonds lay at the very surface of the earth. Thanks to his resourcefulness and determination, Alexander became a global diamond mining magnate. With this wealth, he easily entered the automobile sector and invested in the development of the best car in the world. This car has become a premium star not only for its technical equipment, but also for its level of comfort. Alexander managed to achieve recognition in aristocratic circles, and now the queen herself valued her acquaintance with him. This mega-rich businessman and the country's most promising bachelor suddenly turns his attention to Renee. The marriage proposal was a good chance for Renee to improve her affairs, of course, she agreed, and for a very good fee. 2 years have passed since Renee heard Alexander talk about marriage, and they entered into a mutually beneficial marriage contract. Alexander needed to avoid contact with the queen, and Renee needed to pay off all her debts and continue to care for the orphans. This is just a business agreement, and in 2 years, the relationship between the fictitious spouses has not become one iota warmer or closer. From the outside, they were a wonderful couple, both incredibly handsome with noble origins and ancient families. However, the young husband preferred long business trips and business meetings to communicating with his wife. Renee very rarely saw him at home. The girl couldn't understand why he chose her out of the many women in the country. To be honest, Renee didn't intend to think about it for a long time and suffer about it. There was neither the point, nor the time, nor any particular desire. Very soon, this tiresome 2-year contract marriage will come to an end, and Renee will be free again. Everything will be wonderful. Only Renee will miss her grandmother. She is, of course, a relative of Alexander, but she is kind to the girl. The girl often visited the Marquise, and now she came to the sweet woman's bedroom to chat. Alexander's grandmother, Josie Chambler, loved Renee. In her opinion, a better match for her grandson could not have been imagined. Renee asked about Josie's health and how her leg, which she had sprained yesterday, was healing. Grandma replied that Renee shouldn't worry about her. She just needed a few days of rest, and she would get better. Josie wondered why Renee had dust all over her face, whether she was lying on the floor or gardening or doing something else dirty. Renee replied that none of the above. The girl climbed into the dusty archives in Josie's office and found what her grandmother was looking for yesterday. It was a family photograph showing a young Josie sitting with her now-deceased husband, with her sons, very young viscounts, standing nearby. Grandma's eyes filled with tears, and her voice trembled as she thanked Renee for finding the photograph. Josie became absorbed in contemplating the old photograph and the memories associated with it. Her grandmother remained silent for a long time. Renee was a little envious of this older woman. She had a great and all-consuming love in her life, the kind that every woman dreams of. Renee asked to tell what Josie's husband was like. Judging by the photos placed around the room, the old woman was very close to her husband. Josie replied that Gunther was a valiant and fearless naval officer with a kind and sensitive soul. Gunther was incredibly attached to Alexander. If you think about it, the boy has resembled his grandfather since childhood. Grandmother sighed and said that when she looked at Alexander, she saw in him a copy of his grandfather Gunther. Josie believed that if Grandpa Gunther were alive today, he would be proud of the achievements of his beloved grandson Alexander. Renee felt sad many years ago. When she was 12, her grandfather Gunther died in an accident. His death was unexpected and sudden. Alexander was close to his grandfather and experienced this loss very acutely and tragically. Grandma Josie once again expressed her incredible joy that Renee is the wife and companion of her beloved grandson. Josie was infinitely grateful to the girl for agreeing to marry her grandson. The old Marchioness announced that she wanted to give Renee a gift. Josie declared that she would not accept the girl's refusal. It was an incredibly beautiful necklace, passed down in her family from generation to generation through the female line. Grandmother secretly announced that this decoration has a mysterious power. It fulfills the wishes of the owner, although only this one in a lifetime. Jody herself made a wish, a long time ago, when she was very young. And this wish came true, so Renee can be sure of her words. Grandmother decided that now was the time to pass this relic on to Renee. She had no daughters, and the girl was the only woman close to her. Renee couldn't accept this gift because she and Alexander were getting divorced, which she immediately informed Jody's grandmother about. The poor old woman was alarmed at what could have happened. Had her grandson really screwed up and done something wrong that had offended Renee? Renee replied that everything was fine. They just had different personalities, and marriage and life in Caleb were not suitable for her. Renee planned to return home after the divorce, and therefore could not accept valuable gifts from Alexander's grandmother. However, the old woman was adamant and declared that the fact of the divorce awakened in her an even greater desire to give Renee this necklace. "The world is a cruel place," Josie declared, "and doubly so for kind and honest people like Renee, so this necklace should serve as a consolation to her." A little later, while taking a bath, Renee wondered if she truly believed Josie's words, what wish she would make. The necklace consisted of a large ruby in a gold frame, with diamonds on a long gold chain of the finest workmanship. The girl held the ruby in front of her eyes and stared at it without stopping. The decoration was mesmerizing, and what if it really was magical? Renee was wondering what she should wish for: health, family well-being, or success in business, and various material goods. Renee suddenly remembered how, a long time ago, Alexander had given her a large wreath of wildflowers. The girl didn't understand why it was so big and asked Sasha about it, and he replied that it was a necklace. That necklace was still the most long-awaited and precious gift for Renee. Renee asked if Alexander had made it himself, and why. The boy replied that she said she wanted a necklace. There were no normal jewelers in the area, so he made it himself, from wildflowers, just because she wanted it. Alexander said that she could wear his gift for just a little while, and later, he would definitely give her something worthwhile. The bath was already cooling down, but Renee didn't notice it. She was completely immersed in her memories. On a sudden impulse, Renee pressed the pendant to her chest and asked that the necklace make Alexander happy. At that moment, it seemed to Renee that the most important thing for her was Alexander's happiness, in which there might not be a place for her at all. A moment later, Renee was already laughing at herself. Now was not the time to worry about the most successful and richest man in the world. The girl clutched the ruby in her hand and said that the necklace had forgotten her last wish. Her real wish was to become rich. She wanted to be as rich as Alexander Chandler, and maybe even richer than him, if that was possible. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of a furry, four-legged pet with mischievous children. The cat was not at all afraid of water and boldly approached the bath. The kittens followed her example. Renee decided that the cat wanted to eat. This animal had a strange thing. It allowed only Renee to feed itself and refused to take food from the others. The girl had to get out of the bathroom and urgently go to the kitchen to feed her pet. She couldn't just send her away. The cat and kittens followed their owner, proud that their leatherette was so trainable. Renee petted the cat and asked what food she would prefer today, with fish or with chicken, or maybe moose with vegetables would be more to her liking. The idyll was broken by the appearance of Alexander. He entered the dining room and demonstratively greeted Renee loudly, calling her his wife. The girl was shocked. Alexander had never called her that in the past 2 years. And now, 48 days before the end of the contract, it happened. The thought flashed through my mind that Alexander was glad that this whole thing was about to end and was simply making fun of her. Or, let's say, trolling her a little. There he stands in front of her, all polished, and says, "Hello, wifey, long time no see," and twirls a glass of aromatic elite alcohol in his hands. Renee felt very awkward, barefoot, with wet hair, in a robe on her naked body, and in the company of cats. She did not match this man. The girl threw off her embarrassment. After all, he hadn't warned her, and they weren't at a reception, and asked why Alexander was here. The man chuckled. He came home. He has the right to do so. Renee has something against this, or he disrupted her plans. Renee shrugged. Everything was fine. But usually after a business trip, he went straight to the office. Alexander replied that he had changed his mind today and came home. Suddenly, Alexander extended his hand to Renee and wanted to see what was on her collarbone. The girl pulled away from him She did not want to show herself at all. Alexander was assertive and stubborn, and for some strange reason, he became extremely interested in the state of the girl's body. The man carefully pulled back the collar of the robe and pointed to a scratch near the girl's collarbone. Renee quickly closed her collar and replied that her cat had scratched her by accident and that there was nothing to worry about. Alexander asked if she had treated the wound with anything, but the girl insisted that it was an absolute trifle. Alexander stated that Renee shouldn't be so careless. She has sensitive skin, and even a little redness is too noticeable. Renee didn't really understand what was going on with Sasha and why he was behaving this way. Usually, he hardly noticed her, even ignored her. Alexander decisively placed the glass of whiskey on the table, and an unexpectedly loud knock sounded, causing Renee to flinch. The man stated that despite the fact that their marriage was fictitious, as long as Renee bore the surname Chambler, he would not allow her to tarnish his dignity. Renee didn't understand why Alexander was so upset, how such a scratch could tarnish the dignity of the Chambler family name. Alexander explained that if she walked around with such a wound, people would say that Chambler was so heartless that he didn't even treat his wife. Renee should be thinking about healing the wound as quickly as possible, rather than stubbornly enduring the inconvenience of her presence. Alexander said that he was making sure that the girl did not lose anything as a result of their deal, but she should not cause him any losses either. Renee listened to her husband in silence. As usual, he was talking annoying nonsense in the same spirit, but there was something strange in his behavior. The girl asked Alexander if he was drunk, and if not, then why he was behaving so strangely, not like usual. Renee demanded that Alexander not pretend, but behave as usual. But what came over him today, she somehow felt uneasy about it. Alexander asked what ordinary meant to Renee, and the girl replied that he usually manipulated her and everyone around him. The man suddenly picked up the girl in his arms, and she was so taken aback that she was unable to speak for a while. Renee was outraged by what he was doing. Her husband replied that since he was a manipulator, he decided that he should live up to her definition. The girl tried to resist, but calmed down after Alexander warned her that her robe might come open because of this. He would certainly not mind enjoying such a mind-blowing spectacle, but apparently it would not be entirely convenient for Renee. The girl became embarrassed, pulled down the collar of her robe, and grabbed it tightly with her hands. All she could do was sit quietly in her husband's arms and not chirp. Renee said that Alexander should stop playing the fool and let her go right now, and never dare to do anything like that again. Alexander naively asked why he shouldn't do that. "It's a kindergarten," Renee said, and the man promised to think about it. Suddenly, Alexander lifted Renee up and sat her on a fairly high cabinet and watched her confusion with pleasure. Renee stated that Alexander was definitely not in his right mind today, since he put her here and why he did it anyway. Alexander looked at the girl with a strange, almost predatory gaze and asked if she really wanted to get down from this wonderful closet. In that case, he offered her one way out. To jump into his arms, he is very strong and will definitely catch her. Renee said that she wanted someone else to help her get off. Alexander was indignant. Why didn't he come up to her? He was her husband. Renee said that anyone would be better than him. If he was not going to call another person, then let him at least bring a chair or something like that. Alexander replied that he wouldn't do anything just like that. Renee would have to pay for his services. The girl clarified what he needed. Alexander replied that she should admit that she had missed him in his absence and was glad that her husband had finally come home. The man demanded that the girl say this, and only then would he take her off the closet. Otherwise, he would leave her sitting on it forever. Renee assumed that Sasha had hit his head on a business trip, but he claimed that he was only playing the role of manipulator, just as she wanted. Renee demanded that this farce be stopped. How could he demand that such words be said if he himself would never say such a thing? The girl's surprise knew no bounds when a smiling Alexander said that he missed her on his business trip and that she was his love. Renee became even more scared. The man standing below could not be her husband. He had probably been replaced or had fallen ill. The girl forbade Alexander to continue such speeches. He had to shut up and not say another word. Renee and Alexander spent 2 years of marriage in complete indifference to each other. So why is he now starting to flirt with her? Naturally, the young people pretended to be a loving couple in public, but avoided communicating with each other at any other time. If they did meet, it always ended in a quarrel. as if they hated each other and were blood enemies. But today, the man who had disappeared for 3 months before returned and looks at Renee as if she were wanted or loved. The girl doubted the definition. It was worth assuming that Alexander either ate something strange or was plotting something. The latter was more like him. However, Renee was determined not to participate in this man's adventures any longer. She had had enough of the fictitious marriage. Renee looked down bravely. Even if she jumped from here, nothing bad would happen. She would just scratch her knees. The girl jumped down without warning Alexander. She intended to do without his help, but the man appeared nearby, albeit a little later than necessary. The result of Renee's thoughtless act was a more than strange situation. She was lying quite comfortably on a man stretched out on the floor. In addition to the fact that Alexander's arms gently embraced the girl around the waist, their faces were opposite each other so close that their lips almost touched. Alexander asked worriedly if Renee was okay. Maybe she had hit something. The girl suddenly pulled away from the man and declared that she was perfectly fine and did not need his compassion. She didn't need it at all, but Renee felt very strange. Butterflies came to life in her stomach. She was a little ashamed and happy. Alexander looked at her with the same strange gaze. Or no, his gaze became even more predatory and tender at the same time. Renee was horrified at what she had done. It was all outside the scope of their contract and did not fit in with her future plans at all. The girl started to lament that it was all a mistake and a stupid accident. Their lips did not touch. They just collided with each other. Alexander sat on the floor, his gaze showing resentment and bewilderment. So, Renee thinks that they just bumped into each other by chance, and it was all an insignificant coincidence, a trifle. Renee, as always, is in her element. For her, everything has always been a trifle and an accident. Alexander has never met a more impenetrable person in his life. This tirade completely stunned Renee. What did her fictitious husband mean, and why was he saying such a thing? He definitely hit his head. Renee quickly jumped to her feet, muttered something like, "Sorry, and see you later," and quickly left the room. The girl's flight, entirely expected, but so abrupt, upset Alexander. He had imagined today's meeting with her completely differently. Alexander looked after Renee for a long time. The thoughts that entered his head did not look ascetic. The driver reported that Alexander's car was ready, and it was time for him to go to the office. Business couldn't wait. He needed to leave. Usually, the man would quickly jump into his seat in the car, but today he was strangely in no hurry, as if trying to remember if he had forgotten anything important. Alexander stopped near the car. He felt a gaze directed at him from the window. The man looked back, and pain and irritation flashed in his eyes. Failure again. When will he learn to do everything right? The driver decided that he had done something wrong and tensed up, but his silent question remained unanswered. Alexander was not interested in him at all, but in the slightly swaying curtain in one of the windows of the mansion, he was clearly being watched from behind it. It was from this window that Renee secretly watched as Alexander got into the car and drove away from her and from this house. The girl was afraid of herself and her feelings. She had already been rejected once, so why repeat such a sad experience? Images of close contact with Alexander did not leave Renee's head. Here she fell on him. She did not want to. He exposed himself. Here their lips almost collided, or there was some contact. Renee could not explain all of this to herself. If everything was unclear with the kiss, then she could almost physically still feel Alexander's gentle hands on her waist. In the end, his hurt and offended look came to mind when she declared that it was all accidental and not worth paying attention to. Her head was spinning. Could this really be happening to her? And she had once again fallen under the spell of this man. Renee decided that she was going crazy. This shouldn't and couldn't happen. There were less than 2 months left until freedom. She had to hold out. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the maid, who unexpectedly entered her room. The maid Rose reported that she had heard that Milady was injured and asked to check if everything was all right. Rose asked permission to look after the lady and apply healing ointment to her scratches and bruises. While Rosa was treating Renee's scratch, she asked if she knew where Alexander had gone. The maid replied that he was going to the office and would be gone for a few days. The maid assumed that the owner was busy preparing the largest auto show the world had ever seen. The premium car was chosen by the royal family, and Alexander then announced plans to create a simplified version. This triggered a surge in investment in production and numerous pre-orders, and a grand auto show was planned to mark the occasion. Alexander, busy with work, had hardly seen Renee for the last 6 months. The girl was already regretting that her contract was ending at such a moment. Rose treated Renee's wound and advised her to be careful. "The gentleman is very worried," Rose confirmed. The maid reported that the master had told her to make sure that Renee received the medical care she needed. Rose was convinced that the gentleman loved Milady. Otherwise, where did he get so much care and constant interest in Madame Renee? Renee was convinced that Alexander was completely indifferent to her. He was simply an amazing actor, if even the servants believed in his feelings. When Renee and Alexander divorce, the girl will no longer have to be a spectator and accomplice to this disgusting comedy. And then everyone will be happy, especially Renee. She will have freedom and some money, which she will try to use wisely. An elegant red-haired beauty entered the room. This was another downside to living with Alexander. It was Nina Chambler, the adopted daughter of Alexander's father, a vile and petty person who drank Renee's blood even more than her brother. Without saying hello, Nina asked if it was true that her brother Alexander had come and why she hadn't been told about it. Nina capriciously asked Ren why she wasn't answering whether Alexander had come home today or not. Renee asked if she should first apologize for breaking into her room without permission. Nina stated that Renee hadn't slept anyway and was alone. So what did she see as the problem? Renee understood that Nina was just trying to piss her off. Nina screamed that Renee's rudeness towards her husband's family was outrageous. Apparently, Renee's village roots were making themselves known. Renee calmly and politely reminded Nina that it was Alexander who proposed to her, and she had not shown any initiative to marry. Besides, Renee paused meaningfully. If they were talking about origins, then Nina definitely shouldn't criticize anyone. It was a blow below the belt, but the red-haired boor clearly deserved it. She, of course, tried to object, but there was no reason to do so. Nina was the adopted daughter of the old marquise. Sasha was not yet 15 when her mother died, and her father did not grieve for long. 3 months later, the marquise married a simple seamstress who already had a daughter named Nina, who was distinguished by her quarrelsome nature. About a year later, a fire broke out at the Chambler estate, severely burning Nina's back and damaging her lungs. It later turned out that Alexander was to blame for the fire. He took responsibility and supported his father's widow and her daughter. The second wife, and now the widow of the old marquise, Maggie, left the estate. Nina remained. She was obsessed with Alexander and hostile towards Renee. Nina couldn't come to terms with the fact that her brother had started a new family. Renee tried to understand her and tolerated all the minor provocations, but after 2 years, her patience was running out. Renee responded sharply that Alexander had arrived and gone straight to the office, so if she wanted to throw a tantrum, she should follow him. Nina told Renee that she was just a bed warmer for Alexander, but she was acting like something incomprehensible. Nina's hands clenched into fists, and it seemed like the girl was about to rush at Nina and hit her until she got tired. However, the threat was over. Nina left Renee's room, rustling her skirts and demonstrating her superiority over the whole world. Renee looked irritably after the unpleasant person. Only 48 days left. Not a second more. She would not stay in this house. The maid asked if everything was all right with her mistress, and Renee's angry look towards Alexander's sister scared her a little. Renee replied that everything was as usual. Rose didn't need to worry about it. She could just go and rest. Rose left, taking Madame Renee's promise to call her if she needed anything. Night fell on the Marquis Chambler's mansion, and both the owners and servants slept peacefully in the rooms. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen a man walking down the corridor with a kerosene lamp in his hand, and a lady next to him. It was the manager, Gabriel, and the housekeeper, Lara. They were discussing the fact that it was time to move Miss Nina's room to the 3rd floor, since she had crossed the line. Lara explained that while she was busy with her business, this young lady again made a scene for the mistress. Renee usually asks not to interfere, so Lara remained silent. Gabriel replied that he had also heard Nina say that she was allergic to cats and was forcing the mistress to get rid of her pets. Gabriel was puzzled as to where Nina's allergy had suddenly come from. All her life, this girl had been distinguished by excellent health and a bad attitude. Gabriel and Lara listened and heard that someone was promising a lot of money to the unknown person, but the second one refused and did not agree to the persuasion. The manager and the housekeeper called out to the strangers, asking who was walking around here at such an hour and what they were doing here. When they turned into the corridor from which the whispers of conversation could be heard, no one was visible anymore. The troublemakers had disappeared without a trace. Lara was surprised. She definitely heard a whisper. Maybe they should check all the rooms and find the intruders. Gabriel decided that it was not worth their attention. Among servants, it often happened that someone would ask another to do their job for money. The manager was absolutely certain that this was not the kind of incident that would warrant raising the alarm and waking up the entire building in the middle of the night. Lara had a completely different opinion. Her intuition told her that things weren't so simple. Moreover, the voice of one of the missing conspirators seemed too familiar to her and clearly did not belong to any of the servants. The morning in the mansion was bright and joyful. The jets of the fountain dispersed the heat that had already begun to descend to the earth. Renee accompanied her grandmother on a walk. She said that her grandmother would soon be completely cured and would even be able to run marathons. Grandma asked whether Alexander had returned home after leaving for the office yesterday or not. Renee replied that he hadn't returned. Sasha worked non-stop and even found time for training. The girl doubted whether her husband was a man, but her grandmother replied that she did not have to worry about that. He was a very good person. She remembered his birth. Grandma was lost in her memories and joked that Alexander definitely didn't have a tail or scales, although he looked like a little monkey. Joey and Renee laughed merrily. One could have thought that they were peers talking. So much had Grandma Alexandra retained her youthful enthusiasm. Suddenly, their sweet conversation was interrupted by the person they were talking about. Alexander appeared and expressed the hope that they only had such conversations when no one was around, including himself. The grandmother was glad that her grandson returned home and would at least get some rest. Grandma was wondering why Sasha looked so strange to him. His tie untied, his hair wet. Alexander explained that he looked like an entrepreneur who had just taken a shower after a night of work. Did he really look that bad? The grandmother, smiling, replied that her grandson looked like a fashionable tramp. Alexander joked that he was then the richest tramp in the country, and probably in the whole world. Alexander asked the old woman to allow him to take Renee with him. They needed to discuss a lot in private, and he demonstratively hugged his wife by the shoulder. Renee seemed to accidentally push the man's hand off her shoulder and suggested they have breakfast first, since Sasha was probably hungry. Alexander refused breakfast, explaining that he had already had a snack. He was kind enough to offer Renee to join her grandmother for breakfast, while he waited for her in his room. Grandma was too smart not to realize that she needed to leave, and she said that she wanted to rest and would have breakfast later and went off to her room. The Marquise called Lara and asked her to help her get to the bedroom, while Renee and Alexander were to be left alone. Alexander told his grandmother that whatever her worries, minor repairs would be carried out in a separate wing of the mansion next week. Everything will be very quick and easy. Alexander decided that the house needed an elevator. Renee was pleasantly surprised that even with all his busy schedule, this grandson doesn't forget about his grandmother's sore leg. After 2 years of marriage, Renee realized that Alexander was deliberately trying to keep his distance from his grandmother. All the grandson allowed himself in relation to the Marquise was dry politeness and a restrained sense of humor, and no joint activities. The fact that Alexander signed an expensive contract to install an elevator in a separate wing of the building speaks volumes. In fact, the grandson treats his grandmother tenderly and reverently, but something that happened in the past makes him keep his distance. Renee couldn't understand this, but she didn't dare ask. She was a wife only by contract, and for her there were boundaries that could not be crossed. Renee clarified that if her grandmother no longer needed her, then they could go about their business, and wished the Marquise a good rest. Suddenly, something strange happened. Alexander took her hand, even though they were alone. This had not happened even once in the last 2 years. So, hand in hand, they walked along the path, walking in silence, both afraid to disturb the fragile balance that had formed between them. Holding hands, they walked all the way to the mansion. Renee was surprised at why, starting yesterday, Alexander had started touching her so often. Renee remembered how Sasha gently hugged her around the waist. It was provocative, There was nothing under the robe. Alexander just put his hand on Renee's shoulder, in a proprietary manner, demonstrating that she is his woman. Usually, Sasha kept his distance and avoided even casual touches. Renee's fictitious husband returned from his last business trip a different person. The young people entered the mansion, and Renee reminded Alexander that there was no one around them and that he could let go of her hand. Alexander apologized, justifying himself by saying that he was very tired and didn't even notice that he was holding her hand the whole way. Renee replied that she understood everything and asked what exactly he wanted to discuss with her. Sasha announced that he wanted to talk and therefore took her away from her grandmother. Alexander announced that in 2 days, a dinner for graduates of Brighton College would be held at the palace. It's a 1+1 invitation, so Renee will have to go too. The event was originally planned for later, but was postponed due to rain. Renee was surprised why the event was postponed and what the rain had to do with it if the dinner was supposed to be held in the college dining hall. Alexander said he told the organizers he would not attend the dinner if it rained on the day of the event. Renee was shocked. She knew that her fictitious husband was a big shot, but to influence the situation like this was too much. Brighton College is the most prestigious institution in their country, and perhaps in the world, and has many influential people among its alumni. For his sake alone, hundreds of aristocrats, and even members of the royal family, changed their schedules. Renee never ceased to be amazed at the enormous power and influence of her fictitious husband. The girl warned Alexander not to lie down on the bed in street clothes, even if he was very tired. The guy replied that he never thought his wife would grumble if he lay down on the bed in trousers. Renee objected. He himself refused separate beds, so he must always change his clothes when he is going to lie down in their shared bed. Alexander, feigning submission, took off his shirt and exposed his perfect male torso. Renee was indignant at what he was doing now. Trying to be serious, Alexander replied that he was following her instructions, that is, changing clothes. Alexander began to unfasten his belt just as calmly, but this almost made Renee go into hysterics. The girl screamed that he was crazy for undressing right there and demanded that Alexander cover up immediately. Renee immediately ran to the dressing room to bring Alexander some pajamas. The girl didn't notice how much sadness and despair appeared in the guy's eyes the moment she went to the dressing room. Renee brought him his pajamas, turned her back to him, and asked him to change quickly. But Alexander hesitated, which irritated the girl. Turning around, she saw her fictitious husband sleeping soundly on the bed, naked. Renee thought Alexander was pretending, but he was actually fast asleep and so cute, just like when he was a baby. Trousers, a shirt, even a belt and tie lay in a disorderly heap on the floor near the bed. Renee stood next to the bed in confusion. Alexander hadn't even put on his pajamas, but she had to lie down next to him. That was a problem. The girl was puzzled. Alexander took off everything, even his underwear. It was precisely because of situations like this that she insisted on separate beds. Alexander didn't see the point in separate beds. It could lead others to think that his marriage to Renee was a sham. Renee said they weren't a real couple. The contract only stipulated minimal physical contact and stipulated no intimate relationships. Just because they are husband and wife in public doesn't mean they are close enough to sleep together, Renee believed. Alexander claimed that if they slept in the same bed, it did not mean that anything would happen between them. Alexander's main argument was the condition of the contract, which stated that they should look like an ordinary married couple. She will have to be patient for the sake of credibility, especially since he almost never spends the night at home, since he is very often on business trips or spends the night in the office. Renee had to agree, but lately, Alexander had been coming home more and more often at night and sleeping in the same bed with her. Renee doubted that it was from fatigue. If he really was falling off his feet, he would have stayed in the office instead of dragging himself home every time. The girl knew perfectly well that Alexander had a separate bedroom in his office with all the amenities, including a shower and other amenities. Renee sat down next to Alexander. He was very handsome after all. His hair was tousled and had fallen onto his forehead. She involuntarily brushed it away. Alexander was truly asleep, so defenseless and relaxed. Renee saw him for the first time in her adult life. Today, while sleeping, Sasha looked just like he did as a child, although then he was much nicer and closer to her. The girl heard a piercing cat meow and became alert. She didn't want Alexander to wake up at all. Renee's pets didn't care what their mistress thought. They had a disagreement and decided to have a race for survival within the bedroom. In vain did the girl try to persuade the cats to be quiet and not to run. The spoiled furry creatures were not going to obey her. The noise woke Alexander up. He woke up and sat up in bed, not understanding what was happening. Renee saw how the cat jumped onto the bed and climbed under the blanket. The girl apologized that the cat woke Alexander up. She decided to drag him out and throw him out of the room. The girl put her hands under the blanket and tried to blindly find the cat underneath it. It seemed to her that she had caught the little rascal. Renee tried to gently push the little rascal out from under the blanket, but it turned out not to be a cat. Not a cat at all. Not an animal at all. Alexander was embarrassed. The situation was more than awkward. Not that he was not pleased, but still very awkward. Renee couldn't understand what was going on, and why the cat didn't want to leave the blanket, or whether she was holding a cat. But what was it then? Alexander looked at the fictitious wife and said that she was not a cat, and that he needed to let her go. Otherwise, he would lose the opportunity to get married for real. Renee had never experienced greater shame and awkwardness. It wasn't that unpleasant, but the girl felt like she was ready to die from embarrassment. Clutching at straws like a drowning man, Renee muttered stupidly that it was definitely a cat. She saw it jump here, and what else could be there besides a cat? The real picture of what had happened did not immediately reach the girl's consciousness. She screamed, jumped back from the bed, stumbled and fell. Alexander sat on the bed, red with shame, and covered his face with his hands. Renee saw the culprit of the incident jump out from under the bed and rush out of the room. The cat even looked at the girl with resentment, as if it was her fault that he had to run away so quickly. Alexander had a strange dream. Someone was calling him uncle and demanding that he wake up. Alexander opened his eyes. A boy of about 8 or 10 years old leaned towards him and repeated his request. This child awakened strange sensations and associations in Alexander's mind. His face seemed familiar, but where and when the man could see him was unclear. Alexander sat up. His consciousness transported him to the ocean shore. This beach and the surf line seemed very familiar to him, almost like home. Alexander realized that he was on one of the ocean beaches of Whitehall, a place where he spent his summer holidays with Renee. A legitimate question arose as to why he was there, and the boy asked if he really was Alexander Chandler. Having received a positive answer, the child was delighted, laughed, and said that he knew it and was glad that he was not mistaken. The boy said his name was Heinz and asked if his uncle knew Renee Haslin. Alexander replied that he knew her very well, had known her since childhood. But why did the boy ask about her and who she was to him? The child replied that it was a secret and he should not tell it to anyone. Alexander thought that most likely this boy was from an orphanage organized by Renee and supported by donations, including from himself. The man looked closely at the boy's face and realized that he looked very much like Renee as a child, with the same eye shape and lip shape. The boy smiled and said that Renee often told him about him. Alexander asked what she said. The boy readily replied that Renee had said about his uncle that he was nice-looking, but could be rude and stubborn for no reason, and that he had strange tastes. Alexander asked why Heinz was looking for him. The boy replied that he wanted to ask his uncle one very important thing. The boy became embarrassed, smiled mysteriously, and asked in a loud whisper if Uncle Renee loved him. The question caught Alexander off guard. He understood that it was a dream, and that his own subconscious was asking him, but he couldn't answer himself. The dream continued with a series of unrelated images, mostly fragments of the past. Here is Renee with lavender in her hands. Then Alexander dreamed that he was carrying Renee on his shoulders, and she was not light at all, although she seemed like a reed. The next picture was sad. He was with Renee near his mother's grave. This did not happen in reality, but it was not reality, but a dream. The next shot moved Alexander to a summer meadow. Somewhere ahead, Renee was picking flowers, protected from the sun by a cute hat. The girl turned around and called him by name. She laughed merrily and shouted that no matter what he did, they would be there soon. Alexander walked very quickly and caught up with Renee. He looked at her and kept thinking what he should answer the boy. Suddenly, Renee and Alexander found themselves on a sandy beach, on the ocean shore, the very same one where the boy had just woken him up. Alexander wanted to say something and woke up. He was lying in his bed. Fragments of the dream and impressions from it were mixed up in his head. The man went out onto the balcony. He needed to clear his head of this mess and come to his senses. What kind of nonsense had he dreamed about? The boy asked if he loved Renee Hazelin, but in reality, Alexander wondered how he felt about this girl. Maybe he really did love her. Alexander shook himself. Preparations for the auto show must have really exhausted him. He was dreaming nonsense, and all sorts of things were creeping into his head. A servant came out onto the balcony and reminded him that he had to attend dinner in Breton that evening, and at the same time handed over a note from Renee. Renee informed him that she would leave early and would wait at the Riven Hotel, and also asked him to inform her of the schedule for next week. It was time to discuss the agreement. Alexander read the message carefully. The words about discussing the treaty cut into his consciousness. Alexander ordered Gabriel to prepare the car in 30 minutes. He intended to get ready quickly. Gabriel noted that if Alexander left in half an hour, he would arrive much earlier than the appointed time. Alexander replied that everything was fine, but before picking up his wife, he needed to go to one more place. Renee was busy with her company's affairs, looking through papers and signing the necessary ones. She completely forgot about the time. Dorothy Dampel, an employee of Renee's company, brought her illustrations and materials for the department store catalog. Dorothy reported that Mr. Grog had submitted the new packaging design for approval today, and Roberto's contract still needed to be reviewed. The abundance of documents annoyed Renee, as she wouldn't have time to do everything before Alexander arrived. Dorothy said that she shouldn't complain. Now their soap is becoming more and more popular every day. They should take advantage of this chance. Renee was proud of her success. She had been the director of Pearl de Hazel for a year now, and thanks to her marriage to Alexander, she had gained financial freedom. Immediately after this, she began looking for an opportunity to earn money and remembered her cousin Winchester's soap factory. The soap that Winchester made was of such high quality that it was known not only in one city, but also in neighboring regions. The idea rose to increase the factory's capacity and sales volume, and naturally the number of jobs also increased. As a result, the Pearl and Hazel Company was opened, selling Winchester soap, and a year later, contracts were signed with 10 department stores across the country. Now, Renee has her own office, and such excellent employees as Dorothy. Now the assistant went to the Falache department store to check the layout of the windows. Dorothy said goodbye to Renee and wished her a good time with her husband at the college dinner. Renee thanked her assistant and wished her a safe trip. There were only 2 hours left before dinner. Renee needed to hurry to finish her current chores and get ready for dinner. The funny thing that happened to Renee in the bedroom a few days ago just wouldn't leave the girl's mind. Remembering this, she burned with shame every time, and therefore in recent days she avoided meeting with Alexander. But today, the meeting was unavoidable. Moreover, Renee noted that recently her fictitious husband had become somewhat strange, and she felt uncomfortable being around him. The girl believed that keeping her distance was beneficial for both parties. To this strange deal, there were only 45 days left until the divorce. The closer the end of this marriage came, the more questions Renee had. They said the traditional vows at the altar, "Till death do us part," and all that. This marriage was concluded only for the personal benefit of each. Both parties knew about the fictitious nature of the union and agreed with it. Renee benefited greatly from this marriage, got out of debt, started her own small business, and the shelter continued to operate. It was unclear what benefit Alexander received from this contract. Renee often analyzed the situation and did not understand it. Why did a successful businessman propose a fictitious marriage to her? There are many ruined aristocratic families with more ancient pedigrees in the country. What Alexander really wanted from this marriage was not her young body, that's for sure. In 2 years, he never once hinted at it. There was a knock at the door, and a female voice asked if this was Mrs. Chandler's office. Renee replied that the visitor was not mistaken and allowed her to enter. It was fashion designer Lantier Gavier. She was responsible for Renee's look at today's reception. Renee was glad that Lantier came. She was a famous and expensive designer. It took Renee a lot of effort to persuade her. Lantier was delighted to work with Mrs. Chandler and stated that Renee could count on her completely. The designer didn't get her money's worth. She guaranteed that Mrs. Chandler would be the most beautiful at the reception that day. The Marquis of Chambler's mansion has kept many secrets for generations, and the current Marquis was no exception. Alexander was about to get into the car, but Louis stopped him and said that an urgent matter had come up that required immediate intervention. Louis Dampel was Alexander's personal secretary, and he stated that a partner at the motor show had sent an urgent request, and the matter needed to be resolved today. Louis handed Alexander a folder with documents. He was supposed to look through them on the way to the banquet. At this time, Nina ran out of the mansion doors. She asked Sasha to wait 1 minute and talk to her. Nina asked Alexander to stay for a while and pay attention to her. Otherwise, her brother had completely neglected his sister. Following Nina, her maid Melinda Gosling appeared. She kept saying that Miss Nina was so weak, she needed support. If she fell again, it would be bad. Louis offered to help Miss Nina get to her room if she wasn't feeling well, but Nina replied that she was fine. Nina approached Alexander and asked if it was true that he was going to a dinner party that day and needed a companion. Alexander replied that he was indeed invited to the banquet and was going there with his wife Renee. Nina was unaware that Renee was going to the banquet with Sasha. She saw that the couple had not communicated for the last few days and decided that this was her chance. Nina was never known for her patience and meekness, and despite the categorical refusal, she declared that she also wanted to go. Alexander takes his wife with him all the time. Nina was hysterical. Renee can go whenever and wherever she wants, but she doesn't have that opportunity. Nina insisted that Alexander take her to the banquet today instead of Renee. Was it really so difficult for him to do this? Alexander firmly stated that he had already made a promise to his wife that she would go to the banquet with him and he could not cancel it. Nina could only bite her lips. Alexander refused her. He was going to get in the car and leave. Nina made a disgusting scene. She screamed that Alexander had no right to treat her like that. The girl said that he doesn't understand how hard her life is after that incident. She can't go out freely and can't get married. Nina screamed that Alexander didn't feel sorry for her at all. Although her life was ruined because of him, he and only he was to blame for all her troubles. The girl was clearly playing to the crowd. She pulled off her dress and showed everyone the disgusting scars on her shoulders. Alexander's face turned stony. He had already gotten used to not reacting to his half-sister's hysterics. The past came to mind. The stepmother accused Sasha that the fire was his fault, and now Nina would never be able to live as before, and she would never be a mother. The stepmother screamed that Alexander had ruined both his grandfather and his parents, and had even made her daughter disabled. He was simply the devil. Nina finally fell silent, tear-stained and disheveled. She gave the impression of a city madwoman rather than a well-bred lady. Alexander replied with icy calm that Nina was not ready to go out today, and next time he would take her somewhere nice. Today, according to Alexander, it would be better for Nina to rest, and if she gets really bored, let her go shopping. The car with Alexander was leaving the yard. Nina looked sadly after it. She again achieved nothing. Hysterics no longer had any effect on her brother. Nina had no intention of backing down. What didn't work out today would work out next time. She would still achieve her goal. Alexander would belong only to her. It was the end of the working day. The street where Renee rented an office was filled with people. Clerks were leaving their offices and relaxing in nearby cafes. 3 friends met at a table in such a cafe at the end of the working day. The girls' attention was drawn to a luxurious car that appeared in front of them. It was rare to see such an expensive car in such a remote place, and the girls were curious to know who it might belong to. Alexander Chambler himself got out of the car, and the girls remembered that there were persistent rumors that Mrs. Chambler herself rented an office somewhere around here. Secretary Louis suggested that Alexander wait here while he went to fetch the lady. The guy wanted to please his boss. But no one had to go after Lady Renee, as at that very moment she was going out into the street and apparently saw her husband's car from the window. Renee stood at the threshold in a stylish evening dress that suited her incredibly. Alexander realized that today she would be the first beauty of the evening. The designer hired by the girl did not eat her bread in vain. The dresses, makeup, and all the accessories favorably emphasized Renee's natural beauty. Renee asked Alexander what he thought of her outfit. Today, she was dressed a little extravagantly. Alexander couldn't take his eyes off the girl. He liked her even in her nightgown. But in her evening dress, Renee was truly beautiful. The girl became embarrassed and asked why Sasha was silent, whether her outfit looked too strange. Suddenly, the man leaned very close to the girl. It seemed as if he was about to kiss her right there, in full view of the entire street. Alexander stopped at a minimal distance from her lips and whispered that everything was fine, and the outfit suited her very well. At that moment, Alexander hugged Renee and fastened the chain around her neck. The man pulled back, and a luxurious gold pendant on a gold chain remained on the girl's neck, perfectly matching her outfit in style. Renee asked what it was. Alexander replied that it was his gift. He just saw this pendant in the store and decided to buy it for her. The secretary, Luis, was able to break the silence that hung between the spouses. He confirmed that the boss himself chose the pendant, and it suited Madame very well. Renee was perplexed. Did Alexander really buy her a gift? What happened to him? Maybe he really had gone crazy. She needed to show him to a doctor. Alexander smiled sweetly at Renee and asked if Mrs. Chandler was ready to go and extended his hand to the girl and helped her into the car. In the Chandler mansion, the windows of only one room were lit up. These were Nina's chambers, from which came hysterical screams and the sounds of breaking dishes. The maid tried in vain to calm her mistress. Nina was hysterical, smashing flower vases and screaming hysterically. The maid tried to calm her down and said that if Nina continued in the same spirit, she could get hurt. The girl didn't want to listen to anything. She poured out her discontent and indignation on the things that surrounded her. Nina screamed that Renee Hazelin was a depraved slut, that she had seduced Alexander and was only thinking about how to extort more money from him. At times, the maid felt as if her mistress had gone mad. Nina screamed with such fury that Renee dared to take Alexander away from her. The maid knew Nina's story well. She and her mother, who had seduced Alexander's father, had once settled in the Chandler house. Nina's mother managed to marry the Marquis and convinced her daughter that all his fortune should now belong only to her. More than money and power, Nina was attracted to the Marquis's son, then still very young, but already incredibly charming Alexander. Nina fell head over heels in love with Alexander, and over time, this feeling grew into an obsessive attachment, into a manic idea of marrying him. One day, Nina overheard a conversation between the maids about how the Marquis had punished his son again and locked him in the attic. The maids wanted to free their master. Nina did not try to hide. She came out in front of the servants, who already knew what the Marquis's stepdaughter was like and were wary of her. Nina scolded the maids and threatened to fire them, although the girls had done nothing to deserve her anger. The maids decided that it would be better for them to apologize just in case and disappear from the sight of the naughty girl as quickly as possible. Nina decided to go to Alexander's attic herself. She was irritated that they were related as stepbrother and sister. The girl believed that only she should become Alexander's wife. This was her place by right and by destiny. Alexander and Nina were not blood relatives, which meant that marriage was entirely possible. All that was needed was to make the guy fall in love with her. Nina went up to the attic. She couldn't think about anything else, only about the fact that she wanted Alexander and was ready to be with him. The young man sat on the floor in a dusty and empty room, and it was clear that he was not at all happy about Nina's appearance. The girl tried to prove her usefulness to him and promised to talk to her father so that he would no longer beat the guy and keep him in the attic. Alexander was aggressive towards Nina. He did not need her intercession or instructions. Nina tried to find common ground with him and said that she was now his family and sympathized with him. Alexander stated that Nina Anasia should not delude herself. In fact, he has nothing in common with her. The guy was sure that Nina and her mother had only squeezed into their family for the money and were now trying to pretend that they were family. Nina tried to convince Alexander that he understood everything wrong and that, in fact, her mother loved the Marquis selflessly and devotedly. The guy replied that he would never believe a woman who, 3 months after her friend's death, marries her husband. Nina claimed that in reality, everything was not like that at all. Her mother was very upset when her best friend died. After the death of Alexandra's mother, the Marquise and her mother were united by a common grief, and then feelings arose, a heart no one can control. Nina said that her mother refused the Marquis's very first marriage proposal. He tried to persuade her, convincing her that she needed protection. Alexander stated that Nina was talking absolute nonsense. He saw right through her and her mother. They were both greedy and immoral creatures. As proof, The guy pointed to the dress and jewelry that Nina simply wore around the house. Their cost was comparable to the annual budget of the entire estate. Alexander said that as soon as he and his mother got there, they began to buy jewelry uncontrollably. A little later, her mother demanded the right to manage the finances, and later transferred the lands and house in Linnabella to her own name. After this, Nina claims that it is not about money, but isn't it her mother who turns her father against him and provokes his anger? Nina tried in vain to convince Alexander that her mother had no malicious intent, that all the valuables were voluntary gifts from his father. Even at a young age, Alexander had a good understanding of people. He no longer wanted to listen to Nina and told her to get out. The girl did not lose hope of convincing the guy of her mother's innocence and the sincerity of her feelings for her father. Alexander was completely angry. He couldn't stand this Nina and her mother. They deceived his father, and now they were trying to get close to him. The guy just went crazy, and it ended with him simply throwing the girl out of the room. The girl found herself on the floor of a dusty and dark corridor. Nina burst into tears. She expected something completely different from this meeting. She tried to resume the conversation, but Alexander slammed the door and left, and the girl's pleas were met only with silence. The girl felt that her shoulder was bruised and hurt. No one had ever treated her like that before. Alexander shouldn't be so cold. The girl's eye fell on the kerosene lamp she had brought into the attic, and a terrible and dangerous plan was born in her head. Nina broke a lamp and caused a fire in which she suffered the most. The Chandler's vast mansion, the pride of generations of the family, and the jewel of the marquisate, burned to the ground. The Marquis of Chambler himself died in this fire, and his mother and stepdaughter were seriously injured. The police were very interested in how this could have happened. Society was interested in what would happen to the new wife and her daughter. Only 2 months had passed since the wedding. They believed that they would be thrown out. The police officer visited Nina in the hospital. The girl had barely recovered from the fire, but was quite capable of giving a statement. The police determined that the fire started in the attic, most likely due to a broken kerosene lamp. Nina was in the attic at the time. Of course, she was ready to tell what happened that day and how the fire started, and she did so very willingly. According to Nina, on that day, she came to the attic to free her brother from the room where his father had locked him, and when he left, he pushed her. Nina fell right onto the lamp. It broke. The fire quickly engulfed the entire attic, and then the entire building. Alexander had to apologize to the girl, since she portrayed him as the main culprit of the incident. The young man promised her to atone for his guilt and do everything she wanted. He guaranteed that she would never need anything. At that moment, Nina thought that he would definitely marry her out of guilt. Burns and lung damage seemed like nonsense to her. If all the pain from the consequences of the fire is the price to pay for getting Alexander as a husband, then Nina is ready to endure it. From that day on, Alexander fulfilled Nina's every wish, but suddenly he began to openly ignore his sister and openly care only for Rena. Nina believed that Renee was the only one to blame for everything, that she had ruined all her plans, but the girl was not going to give in so easily. Mary, Nina's trusted maid, entered the room and asked permission to be alone with her mistress. Mary said that she had come to tell Nina what she had asked to be conveyed through Melindra a couple of days ago. Mary's message restored Nina's composure. She sent away the other maid and prepared to listen to Mary's message. It was about a girl who performed various jobs in the mansion. She was an ordinary maid, mainly serving Renee, named Rose. A few days ago, Rosa finished work very late. She was earning money for her mother's treatment and working 2 jobs. The girl saw that it was already past midnight, and she just wanted to get to bed and fall asleep. It turned out that she was not the only one awake. Melindra, Mistress Nina's chief maid, was also wandering around the house. Melindra turned to the girl, asked her name, and announced that they needed to talk. Rose was puzzled by what Madame Melindra wanted from her, especially at such a late hour. She was very tired and was about to go to bed. Melindra stated that from now on, Rosa must carry out Miss Nina's orders, and if she agreed, she would not have any problems with money. Rose asked what she would have to do. Melindra replied that she would help squeeze Renee out of this house and disgrace her in front of Alexander. Rose objected. She was Madame Renee's personal maid and could not betray the one she served. She could only pretend that this proposal did not exist. Rose wanted to wish the ladies a good evening and leave, but Melindra stopped her abruptly. Melindra was indignant. These poor people always have the same excuses. They play at being noble and sincere, but you only have to push them, and they agree to everything. Nina asked if Rosa really thought she could refuse her and get away with it. Nina declared that if Rosa left this room now, she would leave the mansion tomorrow with a black mark. Her big mother wouldn't last long without money. If Rose doesn't care about all this, then of course she can leave. Nina will find another performer and still get her way. But she won't forgive Rose for this. Nina was curious who Rose would choose, Madame Renee or her own mother, who was dearer to her. Nina was pressing on the most painful part. In fact, Rosa's situation was not enviable. If she told anyone about this, they simply wouldn't believe her. Nina realized that she had won and told Rose what she had to do first. Further instructions would be given to her later. The college building resembled an ancient castle, which is essentially what it was, only renovated and equipped with the latest science and technology. The guests at the reception were whispering that Mrs. Chandler herself, the wife of that very Chandler, would be at the reception today, before her marriage. No one knew about her at all. Everyone was shocked when Chandler refused to marry the princess for some provincial woman who managed to bewitch Alexander. We heard that she sometimes appears in high society, but she hardly talks to anyone and always leaves quickly. But even the most evil tongues of high society completely agreed on one thing. Mrs. Chandler is an incredible beauty. Renee was puzzled why people always stared at her like that. Alexander thought it was only because she was very beautiful. The girl was embarrassed. She thought that Alexander was talking nonsense, and that they were looking at her only because she was the companion of the magnificent Marquis Chandler. Alexander claimed that he was speaking more seriously than ever. Of all the girls at the party, Renee was the most beautiful. Renee was perplexed by what was going on. Sasha had not only become more gentle with her, but was now showering her with compliments. He gave Renee a necklace and looks at her so languidly, wondering what's going on with him. The girl suspected that Chandler had something planned and wanted to carry out some kind of scam with her help before the divorce. For whatever benefit Alexander wanted to use her for, the girl felt like a pawn in his chess game. Renee's suspicions grew stronger, and indeed, she knew that things weren't that simple here, and the girl felt a bit creepy. What does Alexander even want from her if he does everything for this that he has never done before? Sasha always easily gets what she wants. Alexander was called by his secretary. He urgently needed to resolve work issues. The secretary said that the boss needed to personally speak with the partners about the documents that had just been signed, and it was urgent. Alexander asked Renee to wait for him. The conversation would not take much time. The girl was left alone in the middle of a huge and crowded hall. The men had gone off to solve their problems. Renee felt awkward at such receptions. She was not used to shining in society and smiling a false smile at people she barely knew. The girl decided to stand aside from the crowd of guests for a while she waited for Alexander. Suddenly, one of the ladies approached her and called her by her first name and the last name she had before marriage. Renee didn't recognize the woman who approached her. The woman said that she was Lauren and that she had studied with Renee at Whitehall School. Lauren smiled sweetly and said that she and Renee had not seen each other for 11 years. Renee recognized her. It was Lauren Sireya. But the girl did not feel any particular joy from meeting her. Lauren was the only daughter of Count Sirius, and the very same evil fury who poisoned Renee as a child. They were 11 years old when Lauren made an unfounded claim that Renee was a thief and had stolen her money. Lauren and her friends claimed that they saw Renee do it, and although her family is a baron, they are poor and can't even hire servants. If Renee didn't take money from Lauren, then where did she get the expensive book? Renee resisted and screamed that her dad gave her the book, and Lauren had no proof that Renee had stolen anything from her. Lauren said that she had evidence, and if not, she would find it or buy it. Lauren's words were confirmed by her hangers-on. They claimed that they had seen Renee rummaging through Lauren's bag and did not listen at all to the fact that Renee had never even seen her bag. Renee was angry. Let Lauren stop lying and give Renee her book back. Lauren threw Renee away from her, calling her a crazy beggar and kicking her right in the nose. Renee wiped away the blood and looked angrily at the offender. It seemed that she would pounce now and then she would be in trouble. Lauren burst out laughing. What could Renee do to her? She could only stare, but in reality, she didn't have the guts. Renee has no money, no parents, only a sick grandfather who can't work at all. and her impoverished family can't do anything to stop Lauren. Renee asked why Lauren was treating her like this and what she had done to her. She doesn't compete with Lauren anywhere or in anything. She's a drag on her grades and prevents her from living and studying peacefully. Lauren replied that Renee would have dared to do anything to her, but Lauren just wanted to treat her that way, and that's all. Lauren doesn't need a good reason to treat Renee like that. She's poor, she's a nuisance, and she's annoying, that's all. Whether Renee actually stole money from Lauren or not, the girl didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that Lauren decided that Renee was guilty. Renee remembered her father wishing her a happy birthday when she was 7 years old. The father gave the girl a wonderful book of fairy tales. It was magnificent, and Renee really liked it. The girl was little, but she already understood that this book was very expensive, and they had very little money. Her father replied that she shouldn't worry. This was her first real birthday present, and it should be special. The father asked his daughter to forgive him for the fact that he was sick and could not do anything more for her, but she was the most precious thing he had. The Baron told his daughter that despite the difficulties, he believed that her future would be full of opportunities. This book was the last memory of her father, and before her eyes, Lorraine tore it into tiny pieces, page by page. Father said that this book should become a ray of hope for Renee. Now this nasty girl was tearing the gift from her late father, dear to Renee's heart, into tiny pieces, reveling in the despair of the victim. The bullying continued until Lorraine left to study abroad, and Renee hoped she would never see her again. Lorraine recently returned and, to everyone's surprise, married the Marquis of Hythe. There were rumors that this was how she improved the family's financial situation. Renee didn't want to communicate with Lorraine, but said ironically that she couldn't forget such a noble lady. Lorraine did too much for her and will forever remain in Renee's memory as her most vivid memory of school. Lorraine replied that she was sorry that they did not have time to communicate more, better, and closer during their school years, but was glad to meet again. The wine splashed in Lorraine's glass, and it seemed like snake venom dripping from the tongue of the newly minted marquise. Lorraine looked at Renee and said that she looked just like a noble lady, and she did not recognize her at first. The only thing that saddened Lorraine was that all this nobility and brilliance was given to Renee by her husband. Renee did not have a worthy dowry. If it weren't for marriage, Renee would probably have had to sell her body, Lorraine suggested. Lorraine proposed a drink to Renee, the Cinderella of Kaliva, who had so successfully married a very successful and rich man. Renee replied that Mrs. Hythe hadn't changed a bit over the years and still loved to judge people and spread lies. So many years had passed, and Lorraine still hadn't grown out of her animal skin and become human. Her brain wasn't capable of developing, Renee suggested. The girl suggested that with such a level of thinking, Lorraine's place was not in the house of the Marquis of Hythe, but in a cage at the Kaliva Zoo. Lorraine replied that there was every basis for her judgment. Renee Haslin had become famous in high society as Cinderella from Kaliva. Renee is penniless. Her morbid obsession is a disgrace to the Chandler family, and her husband has become a target for the press since their wedding. Renee herself is a huge black spot on her husband's reputation. Does all this sound like a fairy tale? Lorraine asked with a sweet smile. A confident male voice said that he did not want to interfere with the ladies' conversation, but he still decided to clear up some misunderstandings. Of course, it was Marquis Alexander Chandler himself. He saw who his wife was talking to and hastened to intervene. He remembered Lorraine very well from her childhood. Alexander said that he had loved Renee since childhood and had been trying to get her consent to marry him for a long time. She refused, but finally agreed and became his wife. Alexander tenderly kissed Renee on the cheek and apologized for his long absence. Lorraine shut up, but her face expressed a whole range of emotions: envy, contempt, and the promise of quick revenge. The Marquis of Failheit approached the company and told Lorraine that he had excellent news. Fail noticed the Chamblers and greeted them politely. Fail showered Mrs. Chandler with compliments and asked how Alexander felt with such a beautiful wife. Lorraine interrupted her husband and asked what good news he brought. He replied that after dinner, there was a big card game planned. It would be fun. Lorraine replied that she had once been a star among the ladies at the card table, but had not played for a long time and wanted to show her class. Lorraine suggested that Mr. and Mrs. Chandler join the game, which would help raise the stakes and make the game even more exciting. Alexander agreed. He had long been interested in how strong Mrs. Height was at the card table. Now he planned to see it. Renee tried to object. She doesn't know how to play cards at all. If she loses everything, what will Alex do then? Alex replied that she hadn't even started yet and was already thinking about losing. But even if she lost everything, it wouldn't be a big deal. Renee warned that the truth could lose everything and let Alex not complain later that she didn't warn him. Alexander replied that none of this mattered. And even now, while she was arguing, his money was steadily increasing. Alexander advised his wife to play to the fullest and not deny herself anything. There was a commotion at the card table. Mr. Chandler had won completely and utterly. The players found the game exciting and interesting for the first time in a long time. All in, full house, and a straight flush on top. It was cool. Lorraine looked at the cards that had been played and couldn't understand how something like this could have happened. She had been playing for a long time, but she had never seen anything like this. The players admired Chandler, who not only returned all the money his wife had lost in the first round, but also thoroughly emptied the Heights' coffers. Mrs. Height lost at least 1 billion Reddits to Alexander, enough to buy 5 luxury mansions. What will happen to the Heights now? Mr. Height yelled at Lauren for acting confident and saying she was sure she would win, but she actually lost it all. Last month, she blew all her money, and today she lost 1 billion in a few hours. Fail was outraged by his wife's carelessness and her ability to spend money in one moment and for nothing. Lorraine tried to convince her husband that such a straight flush could not possibly have come up with the given hand. But Fail did not want to listen to her. Alexander heard Lorraine's words and objected that he was not such a skilled scammer, that he could have pulled off such a scam in front of so many people. Everyone was interested in how much Lorraine had lost, and it was suggested that they move on to calculations. Lorraine hesitated. It was a friendly game, and the stakes were high. She needed to be lenient and not demand the whole amount from them at once. Alexander replied that he was a businessman, and that card debt was a sacred thing, but he could provide them with an installment plan to pay off the entire debt. Fail was angry with his wife and left her to figure things out on her own, and said that if she couldn't handle it, he would simply divorce her. Alexander addressed Lorraine with words of regret about the current situation, but his intonation was laced with evil irony. The man filled a glass and offered her a toast to Lorraine, the Cinderella of Kaliva, who had married so unsuccessfully. Lorraine realized the desperation of her situation and asked Mr. Chandler to give her the opportunity to speak with him alone. Alexander replied that if she had something to say, he would listen to her here too, unless, of course, she was planning to seduce her classmate's husband. People started whispering that Lorraine and Renee were indeed old acquaintances, but if Lorraine got divorced, her family would go bankrupt. Lauren admitted that it would be difficult for her to raise such a sum at the moment. Perhaps he could forgive her this debt as a gentleman. Alexander thought about it. Of course, he couldn't just forgive Lorraine's gambling debt, but he had a cunning plan from the very beginning. Chandler offered Mrs. Lorraine another option for the development of events, and she agreed without even specifying what exactly he would require of her. Alexander wanted Lorraine to kneel in front of everyone and ask his wife for forgiveness for all her dirty tricks in the past and the nastiness of today. Perhaps for the sake of his beloved wife, Alexander will show mercy to Lorraine. Renee's mind was transported back to the distant past, to the very day when Lorraine had torn her book apart and she had hidden in a cave on the ocean shore and cried. It was raining, and the girl felt as if nature was crying along with her, and this made her feel better. The torn pages of the book, dear to her heart, appeared before Renee's eyes again and again. The pieces fell to the ground, sometimes hitting Renee's face, and it was very painful. Suddenly, Alex came into the cave from the thick of the rain and asked what Renee was doing there. The boy looked closely at his friend and saw that her eyes were swollen from crying, and there was a red bruise on her cheek, and he asked what happened to her face. Renee replied that it was just a scratch. She was careless and hit herself. Alexander asked why she was sitting here in a cold cave, especially in such a downpour. Renee didn't answer. Sasha sat down next to her and asked why she let her offenders get away with everything. How could she allow herself to be treated like that? Renee was surprised by Sasha's breakdown. It seemed to her that no one knew anything about the conflict with Lorraine. Instead of answering and justifying herself, Renee pounced on Alex with questions about how he knew everything and who told him. In fact, Renee didn't want Alexander to be aware of this side of her life. She didn't see the point in his interference. Renee really can't do anything against Lorraine's family, so why do anything? Even trying to fight is pointless. Instead of answering, Alex took out from his bosom and placed on her head her book, the very one that Lorraine had taken away. The boy announced that it was his gift to Renee, and he hoped that the book would improve her mood and the girl would stop crying. Renee was glad that her father's gift had been returned to her and asked him how he had managed to get the book back. The girl opened the cover and saw that the pages of the book were carefully collected and glued together from small pieces. Renee was pleasantly surprised that Alexander had really found, collected, and glued together all these pieces, bringing life back to the damaged book. How happy Renee was about this, but he still had to tell her how he managed to do it. Alexander willingly told how yesterday he decided to take a walk in the forest that grows on the rocks along the ocean. The boy heard the voices of children talking about Renee and apparently looking for her, clearly with bad intentions. The children called Renee a beggar and were surprised how she endured all their bullying without crying. She had a lot of pride, but there was no benefit from it. One of the guys asked Lorraine what they should do with this book now. The girl decided that the book should be thrown into the sea so that Renee would never find it. The guy agreed with his friend's decision and took on this responsibility as the strongest. He swung carefully when suddenly a strong hand grabbed his wrist. The guy snapped at Alexander, asking what he was doing there and how dare he grab his hand and take the book away. The teenagers were aggressive. Who was he to take away their book? Alexander did not listen to their indignation. He unfolded the cover and asked where they had put the torn pages. Lorraine was shocked. How dare this guy ignore her and not answer her questions? Moreover, he demands that she answer him. Alex demanded to be shown where they had left all the torn-out pages of this book. Sasha said that quite a lot had been torn out, but he found all the pages and glued them together. He had to work all night, not even going to bed. Alexander declared that Renee now owed him. The guy thought that the girl would be happy and smile, but she suddenly started crying. Sasha got scared and asked why she was crying now, but he returned the book to her, and it was almost intact. Renee replied that she was crying with joy. She thought she would never see this book again, and it was a gift from her dad for her 7th birthday. The boy laughed. She was serious. You should smile from joy, not cry. Why was she so stupid? Alexander took out a handkerchief and wiped away Renee's tears. He tried to persuade her not to cry, because everything ended well. The boy said that Renee shouldn't cry, because when she cries, she becomes ugly. Renee hit him hard for these words. Sasha was indignant. Was this really her way of repaying his kindness? And why was he saying that it was in vain? Renee was indignant. However, the girl was sincerely grateful to Sasha for returning this book to her. It was very important to Renee. The girl explained that it was a gift from her late father for her 7th birthday, and that she dreams of becoming a veterinarian. When she worked on the farm, Renee saw sick animals being abandoned or euthanized. She always wanted to cure them, but she couldn't. That's why Renee decided that when she grew up, she would become a veterinarian to cure all the sick animals. Sasha suggested that in this case, she should enroll in a renowned veterinary college. Renee would have liked to do this, but there was no money for tuition. Alexander replied that it always seemed to him that belonging to the nobility meant nothing, and that others lived no worse than the nobles. Renee said that when she was very little, everything was fine, and the family had money. When she was 3 years old, her father got into a financial misadventure. Her mother left. Her father got sick and died when she was 7, so now she lives with her grandfather. Alexander asked if she really had no one else. Renee said that she had an uncle, but he served in the church, and she didn't expect any help from him. Renee didn't complain about her life. She lived well with her grandfather. They maintained a small farm and paid off their debts. Everything suited Renee, but the bullying from children from wealthy families was unpleasant to her. Renee had done nothing wrong and didn't understand what she was guilty of. Alex advised her not to pay attention. Why should she care what those who hated her said? She needs to understand that these kids are just stupid and have decided to hate Renee no matter what she does. They just want to bully someone. Sasha thought that she shouldn't waste her feelings on those who weren't worthy of her. The boy handed Renee a jar of ointment and advised her to smear it on the wound on her cheek. Alex saw Renee's indecision and decided it would be better if he did everything himself. As the boy tended to Renee's wound, he looked focused and caring. Renee calmed down and asked why Alexander treated her so well, treated her wounds, played with her, and glued a book together for her. Sasha replied that it was because she was always getting into trouble. Renee was worried that she probably just looked pathetic. Sasha replied that he didn't consider her pathetic. He just cared about her as his friend. But when the holidays are over and he returns to California, Renee shouldn't give up because he will always be by her side. Renee stood on the balcony of a real ancient tower. How long ago it was. Her conversation with Sasha in a quiet cave on the ocean shore. He promised to be on her side. The past, the distant past. But why can't Renee let go of these memories and continues to live with a ghostly hope? Alexander was the first friend that lonely Renee had. She remembered him saying that he was worried about her as a friend, not out of pity. Back then, as a child, Renee believed that Alexander would always be on her side, would always support her, and she would be able to repay him in kind. The night was warm, the moon was bright, but Renee's thoughts were sad. Her childhood dreams had not come true. Renee's first love began with the belief that Alexander supported her, so she agreed to this marriage, of course. The main reasons were financial. But deep down, Renee harbored the hope that maybe Sasha could treat her again the way he had when she was a child. Renee was very interested in the answer to the question of why their relationship ended so suddenly at 16. Why did he hate her? Write such a harsh note? Why did he drive her away and not even give up hope of a meeting? Only Alexander, whom she met 8 years later, was a completely different person. Alex said that he provides sufficient financial support in accordance with the contract and does not have to solve any trivial problems. She shouldn't even think that Alex could become her real husband and had long since left the naive age of childhood, meaning there was no way back to the previous relationship. So what happened now, on the eve of the divorce? Alex forces her old enemy to kneel before her and beg for forgiveness. In front of all the high society, he declares that for the sake of his wife, he will show mercy to Lady Lorraine. Something is wrong here, Renee was sure. Lorraine, devastated by the loss and Alexander's demand, but did not agree to kneel before Renee. It was a scandal. There was an opinion that the demand to kneel before his wife was a cruel joke from Alexander. Why should he bother with unnecessary troubles? He could simply forgive Lorraine. Alexander stated that of course he could, but he did not want to. Every evil must be punished. This determination surprised Renee. Of course, Lorraine was attacking her and simply dreamed of disgracing and humiliating her in the eyes of society. Only Alexander, whom she had known for the last 2 years, would never care about her honor or take her side. This news will become a topic of gossip in social circles and could affect Alexander's own reputation. The girl was clearly confused. She didn't understand why her fictitious husband was playing such a complicated game. If he wanted to demand something from her, he could simply say that she had not brought him any benefit in the marriage, and that she was his debtor. Why do something so complicated if there is a very simple way? And Alex suddenly began to behave as tenderly as he did back then, in childhood. When he began to take care of Renee, she returned to her previous delusions and began to hope for the return of their previous relationship. This hope always lived in the very depths of Renee's soul. Only each time she was convinced of the impossibility of this. Alexander was too unapproachable and unpredictable, like today, for example. Renee looked out the window, connecting the banquet hall and the balcony, where she saw Alexander smiling. The girl was annoyed to see him so calm when her soul was in complete confusion and chaos. This behavior of the fictitious husband unexpectedly irritated the girl herself. Suddenly, Renee heard a woman's voice whispering that she missed him very much, but he was constantly avoiding her, and they told her to let him go and let him explain. The unknown woman tried to convince the man that there was no one there and that he could hug her as much as he wanted, but the man resisted and said that he was nobody to her. Renee decided that some man was in a difficult situation and she should give a sign that there were people here, that is, she. The girl coughed loudly. The woman who was harassing the man became frightened and let go of her victim. Promising to see him later, the predator picked up her skirts and instantly disappeared from the balcony. The man stayed and apologized to Renee. He had unwittingly shown her an unpleasant scene, but the girl said that she had not seen anything. The man clarified that she was not by any chance the same Lady Hazelin, the head of the Hazelin shelter. Renee confirmed this and asked how he knew her. The guy replied that it was an honor to meet her again and introduced himself as Leverus Ritney, who had volunteered at her shelter 4 years ago. Now that Sachs Ritney was running his own travel agency, Renee apologized for not recognizing him and introduced herself as Renee Chambler. Leverus didn't expect that Renee was already married. He had lived abroad for a long time, so he wasn't aware of this news. The guy asked Renee to keep him company for a while. He was afraid that the woman would catch him again if she saw that no one was around. Renee agreed and joked that the moon was very beautiful today, and she was bored looking at it alone. The girl added that she would be glad to listen to foreign news while her husband was busy with business. Ritney thanked Renee. She was so kind to him that he didn't know how he could repay her. The girl smiled and chatted pleasantly with the young man, experiencing a pleasant ease of communication. Renee liked this young man. He was nice, and his face reflected all the emotions, in general, the complete opposite of Alexander. It was only after some time that Renee began to notice that he was looking at her too intently with a distrustful expression. Renee asked why he was looking at her like that, whether there was something strange on her face, or whether her clothes were a mess. Ritney apologized. He was impolite. He looked too closely at the lady, in fact. Even back then in the shelter, she reminded him of his younger sister. The guy asked not to consider this a cheap pickup line. He didn't mean at all what the lady was thinking about now. As proof, he handed Renee a photo of his younger sister in a nurse's uniform. This photo was taken not long ago. My sister was serving in a military hospital and caring for the wounded. Renee agreed that they were very similar, but his sister was much prettier. Ritney decided that the lady was much prettier, and his sister had a nickname, Little Pig. Renee replied that her husband also called her Ugly Cousin Pig. Renee did not know that the Heiserling and Chambler families were friends. Renee explained that Alexander's grandfather and her own were best friends, and that Chambler and his grandson came to Whitehall every summer. Renee regretted that she didn't have a photograph of young Alexander with her. As a child, he was quite the naughty boy, not like he is now. Suddenly, Alexander's voice was heard. He said that it was offensive to him to hear this. He was looking for his wife, and she was gossiping about him with another man. Alexander demonstratively hugged Renee around the waist and gave her a tender look. Renee was slightly surprised by Alexander's unexpected appearance and immediately rushed to introduce him to her new acquaintance. Alexander bowed to Leverus Ritney and heard that they had met at the opening ceremony of Crystal Palace, but were not introduced. Alesk expressed his regret that he did not remember Leverus, but expressed the hope that now they would bow as good friends. Without dragging out the conversation for long, Alexander asked Mr. Littree to leave him and his wife alone. They needed to talk. Littree turned out to be an incredibly polite and unobtrusive young man. He hastened to politely say goodbye to Renee and leave. Left alone with her husband, Renee asked what he urgently wanted to talk to her about. Alex asked what she wanted to tell him. The girl replied that she and Alexander were not in such a relationship that she had the right to speak. Alexander asked if she was a bit too self-confident for a woman who had been caught discussing her husband in his absence. Renee was indignant. She wasn't making anything up. Alex was naughty as a child and often called her a piglet. Alexander pretended that the events of his childhood had been completely erased from his memory. Renee was offended and called him impudent. Alexander actually didn't want to talk to Renee about this at all. It was about the recent card game. Renee stated that she herself wanted to ask him something, and it really was about what had happened at the card table. Renee asked Alexander not to evade the answer, but to tell her everything honestly. The girl was interested in why Alexander treated Lauren Heights so cruelly, since she hadn't done anything to him. Alexander didn't see anything special in his actions, but Renee insisted that he wouldn't do something like that without a reason. Alexander was glad that Renee had gotten to know him so well over all the years of their communication. The man stated that there were no special reasons that influenced his actions. He was simply doing his duty. Renee was surprised at what debt he was talking about. The relationship with Lorraine was her personal business. Alex reminded her of his promise that she would not have any troubles in this marriage. Alexander explained that Renee was present at the banquet because of a contract, and therefore she clashed with Lorraine for the same reason. Moreover, insulting a wife is equal to insulting a husband, and in this case, Alexander could not remain on the sidelines. Renee realized that he was absolutely right, and that the current Alexander was exactly like that. He valued the terms of the contract and his reputation. In Renee's opinion, in Alexander's eyes, she is just a burden, unable to stand up to people like Lorraine. She looks so pathetic. It was not for nothing that he said then that he would take pity on anyone for the sake of his wife and intervene himself. Alexander's own reputation was the real reason for his intercession for her. And what else could one expect from him? Renee sighed. The girl turned to her fictitious husband and said that she was very sorry that she had burdened him with her concern. She should have dealt with Lorraine herself. Lorraine Height is Renee's personal problem, and it doesn't concern Alexander at all. The man replied that he didn't think so, which greatly surprised Renee. Alexander stated that he never considered Renee pathetic, neither as a child nor now. Alex considered his fictitious wife simply a victim, but neither in childhood, nor especially now, did she bear any blame for the current circumstances. That is precisely why she does not need to apologize to him. Alexander did not understand why she asks for forgiveness for something that other people are to blame for. Renee was surprised why Alexander was again pretending to take her side. Alex said he understood that traumatic memories weren't easily forgotten, but Renee shouldn't worry about that. Alexander asked why Renee didn't put aside unnecessary thoughts and just enjoy this evening. Alex took Renee's hand and placed some gambling chips into her palm for betting at the card table. These were chips of a fairly large denomination, and his act looked like a very generous gift. At that moment, Renee and Alexander's eyes met, and in his gaze she saw echoes of the distant past. At that moment, Alexander looked at Renee with blue eyes, the color of which was similar to the color of the ocean water off the shores of Whitehall. Renee remembered the 11-year-old boy she had met 8 years ago, who had been her first love. The old hope that had made her agree to sign this strange contract was kindled again in Renee's soul. Renee thought that maybe Alexander had no other goal. Maybe all these business relationships were just fluff and a tribute to convention. What if she's very wrong about him, and all this time he just wants to get along with her again, like before? The girl took a deep breath and wanted to ask him about it, but apparently Providence did not want Renee to know the truth. Suddenly, thick clouds rolled into the clear night sky. The moon hid, and a sharp cold wind rose. A cold rain began to pour down from the sky in a continuous stream. Renee shivered, feeling uncomfortable in her thin evening dress. Alexander suggested that the girl continue the conversation inside. If they stayed here, she would definitely catch a cold. The couple returned to the warmth and comfort of their rooms, and the usual bustle reigned at the gaming table. The banquet guests noticed that it had started to rain outside and decided to entertain themselves with some appropriate music. One of the gentlemen said that he knew some music that was perfect for rainy weather. They started the gramophone, someone asked what the composition was called, and they answered that it was the last work of the brilliant composer. The author committed suicide on a rainy day due to severe depression. The melody, oddly enough, received a major name and is now known as Summer Festival. As soon as the first bars of the melody flowed through the hall, Alexander's behavior changed. He turned away from Renee and wished that she would go home. The change was so radical that the girl thought she had misheard and asked again what Alex meant. But he no longer listened to her, but silently and with a determined look walked towards the exit of the room. Renee caught up with Alexander in the hallway and grabbed the sleeve of his jacket, trying to detain the guy and find out the reason for his sudden change in mood. Alexander rudely answered Renee that he told her to go home. She should not worry about him. Just let her leave as quickly as possible. Renee announced that she couldn't leave him here in such a strange state. Everything was fine. But why did he change his mind so abruptly? Alexander turned around sharply and almost angrily shouted at her not to bother him. Alexander stated that he had expressed his thoughts completely clearly and understandably, or she had begun to hear poorly. The man repeated that Renee should go home and stop getting in his way. Renee relaxed and almost forgot that all these long 2 years had actually meant nothing to Alexander. It was all just a contract, and Alex was burning out any hope in Renee with that very look he was looking at her with now. The man asked what had suddenly happened to Renee today, whether his fake wife had suddenly decided to become real. The young people stood alone in a completely empty corridor, and no one could hear their conversation. Alexander asked Renee to stop playing the fool. There was no one here, and there was no point in pretending to be a loving couple. Of course he was right. He and Renee were connected only by a pathetic piece of paper called a marriage contract, and it was not destined to become real. Alexander always looked at Renee with disdain and never let her forget for a second that he had paid for everything. So Renee always tried to stick to this boundary that they both had established by mutual agreement. Renee never forgot what her relationship with Alexander really was, that it was all just a fictitious marriage. She just didn't understand what was happening now. The contract was expiring, and Alex was wasting all her efforts and causing some kind of swings. Renee got angry and decided to ask Alexander an important question. The girl looked defiantly at her fictitious husband and asked if he really considered her expendable in his big game. Alexander responded to Renee with a corresponding look and said that she was absolutely right. Everything was exactly like that. Renee can be sure that she is nothing more than a thing, and like everything, she must be true to its purpose. Alex advised Renee not to be too presumptuous and to fulfill her duties within the framework of the contract. Renee bowed her head. What was the point of arguing if she couldn't win anyway? The girl stood next to Alexander for a few more moments and informed him that with his permission, she would leave. Turning around, she quickly and decisively walked down the corridor. It was time for her to go home. Her work was over for the day. Alexander was left completely alone in the corridor, but for some reason, he didn't look like a winner at all. The man made sure that Renee had left and hurried to take his medicine. He always carried a bottle of pills with him in his jacket. Alexander quickly opened the cap and took a couple of pills, which made him feel a little better. The sounds of the gramophone coming from the next room loosened the strangling grip, but did not silence the voices in my head. These voices were screaming that it was he who killed his mother. If he hadn't gone to Renee that day, then everything would have been fine. Sasha will never forget that terrible moment. He ran into his mother's room. They hadn't seen each other for a long time and saw something that it would have been better for him never to see. The chair was lying on the floor. His mother's legs were dangling a meter from the floor. Sasha still couldn't bring himself to raise his head up. He only screamed and cried hysterically. The bright morning sun illuminated the Chambler mansion, and no one would have believed that these walls held bloody secrets. Renee woke up. She had hardly drunk anything at the reception yesterday, and therefore did not have a headache. The girl had other concerns. She glanced to the side, wanting to immediately determine whether she was alone in bed or not. The bed was empty. It looked like Alexander hadn't shown up at home at all that night. The memories of the previous evening stuck in her throat like a heavy lump. He was rude again and categorically sent her home. Renee shouldn't have relaxed and shown her concern about his mood. Then the girl wouldn't have run into another rudeness. Alexander again showed Renee her place. He told her that she should not be presumptuous and should be true to her destiny. Renee didn't understand why she was so upset. He had often been harsh, even as a child. This sweet boy with blue eyes could win anyone's heart and then immediately shatter that person's feelings into pieces. Renee was angry at both herself and Alexander. She decided that now it was really all over, and she would no longer fall for his charm. Grandmother Alexandra entered the girl's room, and the old woman wished Renee good morning. Renee rushed to her in alarm. She knew that her grandmother was unwell, but why did she come to her when she could easily have called Renee to her place? Grandma replied that everything was fine. A short walk was good for her. She just wanted to have a cup of tea with Renee and chat. The grandmother gave her grandson's wife some new lavender tea that she had just recently bought, and the aroma was wonderful. For dessert with tea, a wonderful peach pie was prepared. The old woman really wanted Renee to try it. Renee asked her grandmother what was the matter, that the old woman got up so early and surrounded her with care. Grandma replied that yesterday she saw Renee return from the banquet and was not in the best mood, and now she was worried about her. At first, the old woman wanted to pretend that she hadn't seen anything, but she was too worried, and Alexander hadn't appeared at home since yesterday. Grandma said that Renee doesn't have to answer if she doesn't want to, but it would be great if the girl admitted what happened. Renee decided to ask her grandmother if he knew what the melody that everyone calls the summer festival is connected to in Alexander's life. The thing is that yesterday, as soon as this melody was turned on at the banquet, Alexander immediately felt ill. Grandma immediately looked haggard and replied that it was a very sad story, but since Alex hadn't told Renee anything, she would do it. The whole world thinks that the death of Alexander's mother, Blair, was an accident, but it was not. the grandmother said. In fact, Blair hanged herself. She stunned Renee with an unexpected revelation. The worst part is not even that. The one who first found Blair was her own son, Alexander. Sasha was getting ready to hit the road. The holidays were finally over, and he would go to the ocean. He would see her there. He wondered if she would like his gift. His thoughts were rosy. The guy was looking forward to a great summer, but he was distracted by his mother's voice. She was sorry that her son was leaving again. Blair walked into her son's room. She had been feeling lonely lately and hoped to convince Sasha to spend the summer at home. The woman realized that her son was attracted to some girl and suggested inviting her to visit them. But who at that age wants to sit at home with their parents? Sasha was eager to get out into the open, to the ocean. The guy tried to get rid of his mother and promised to invite his girlfriend to visit them next summer. Alex thought that it would be even better if they went to the ocean together. No one would be against him coming with his mother. The mother agreed with him, of course. It would be better this way. They would definitely go to the ocean together next year. A cheerful and happy Alexander said goodbye to his mother. He would arrive very soon and tell her about his adventures. Sasha didn't see how his mother's gaze faded, and her hands drooped when he slammed the door behind him. Returning at the end of the summer, he saw that terrible picture that he would like to forget, but will never be able to do so. Alexander did not immediately understand what had happened. He was full of impressions and a desire to share his joy with his mother. Sasha rushed to the cooling body. He screamed. The servants came running to his scream, but it was too late. People running into the room saw Sasha hugging the legs of her mother, who had not eaten for just a couple of hours before her son's arrival. The suicide's room was filled with sounds. It was raining and thundering outside, and a gramophone was playing in the room. Rain, thunder, strange music, and the loud cries of a grief-stricken son, all mixed into one symphony of terrible disaster. The Marquis, Sasha's father, concealed his wife's suicide and announced that she had died as a result of an accident. He protected Blair's reputation and that of his family, and did not make his son's life more difficult, but he was unable to console Sasha in his grief. Alexander suffered from deep depression for a long time and blamed himself for his mother's death. Grandma sighed. They say that at that time, the summer festival was playing on the gramophone in Alexander's mother's room. Grandmother's story made an indelible impression on Renee, and now Alexander's behavior appeared in a completely different light. The girl could not even imagine that Alexander had to go through this, and at only 16 years old. Renee remembered him screaming at the summer festival party and trying to run as far away from the sounds as possible. The wounds that formed on Alexander's heart after his mother's death have still not healed. Renee was distracted from her sad thoughts by her cat, Rain. She caught the girl's dress with her teeth and tried to lead her somewhere. Renee hadn't seen the cat all day, and it was unclear where she had been or why she looked so rumpled. The cat was incredibly excited and insisted that Renee come with her, making sure that her owner paid attention to her. Rain started to run. Renee couldn't understand what was happening to her favorite, but she still followed her. Pretty soon she caught up with the cat, who was scratching and biting the door of the room, which Renee didn't want to enter at all. Rain was in a real cat hysteria outside the chambers of Alexander's half-sister, Nina Chambler. Why, of all the rooms, does Rain want to get into this one? Renee grimaced with annoyance, politely knocked on the door, and asked permission to open it. An irritated Nina appeared at the threshold of the room. She was not happy about Renee's visit and rudely asked what was the matter. Nina stated that Renee had to explain to her what was going on and why she dared to disturb her. Renee apologized for checking on Nina so late, but could she please check if her cat's kittens were in her room? Nina feigned indignation. What kittens are we talking about? Renee decided to search her chambers. This is unreasonable and ridiculous. Melinda confirmed the lady's opinion and reprimanded Renee for his outrageous behavior towards Nina. Renee interrupted the maid's tirade and announced that she was talking not to her, but to Nina. Nina stated that there were not, and could not be, any kittens in her room. She was allergic to them. Renee's maids observed the incident and decided that if Nina had an allergy, the missing kittens should be looked for elsewhere. In that case, Renee asked permission to pick up Nina Rain, who had just run through the door from her room. Nina was categorically against Renee entering her room. She didn't have any nasty cats, she said. Renee irritated Nina. She saw her only as an obstacle to her plans regarding Alexander. It is because of her that Alexander did not take Nina to that reception yesterday, and it is because of her that he will not marry Nina. Nina was never known for her restraint, and now she had completely lost control of her actions. Nina screamed that Renee dared to behave like that just because she had a wedding ring on her hand and swung her arm to hit him. Renee closed her eyes in anticipation of the blow. She didn't want to oppose Alexander's sister. Just recently, he had once again pointed out to her that no one. But for some reason, the blow did not come for a very long time, and the girl dared to open one eye and see what was happening around her. Alexander stood next to Renee and hugged her tightly by the shoulder with one arm, while with the other, he grabbed Nina's hand, which was ready to strike. Renee didn't expect her fictitious husband to appear right here and right now. Alexander held his stepsister's hand tightly. This girl had gone too far. Alex asked how long Nina had been behaving like this, and how she dared to behave like that towards his wife. While Grandma was telling Renee about the terrible events at the Chambler estate, Alexander was busy working in the city office. The final days of preparation were underway for the auto show that was to become the calling card of Alex's company. However, neither large-scale tasks nor long-term planning could drive the events of the previous evening from Alex's thoughts. He offended Renee again. What a demon had entered into him again. He declared that she was a false wife and a thing. He told her that she shouldn't be presumptuous and sent her home. And what about Renee? She bowed her head obediently, answered, "As you say," and left. The secretary saw that his boss's thoughts had wandered and, slamming the folder shut, declared that it was time for them to go home. Alex didn't understand, but the secretary said that the owner needed to go home, take a bath, and sleep for at least 10 hours. Michel Ankes, another of Alexander's secretary, was not just an employee, he was the boss's best friend. Alexander tried to object. He said that they still had a lot of work. Michel replied that if Alex continued in the same spirit, it would affect the quality of work, so he should go home and sleep. If Alex didn't listen to him, Michel promised to go on strike. Alexander declared that Michel had gone mad. The secretary confirmed this, but only because no one can remain sane while communicating with a madman. Alexander gave in and asked to prepare a car for him. He agreed to go home and rest. Alex knew that without a secretary, he wouldn't be able to cope with the current volume of work, so Michel blackmailed him. On the way, both men were glad that they had a car. It was pouring rain, and they reached the mansion in comfort. Alexander invited Michel to stay the night at his house. Michel readily agreed. It was raining, and the guy didn't want to drive back on the wet road. Gabriel met the gentleman at the door and was instructed to prepare a room for Michel and to give them both something to eat. While talking to the butler, Alex heard his wife's voice, and then Nina's angry cry that she didn't have any cats. Alexander became curious about what the women were screaming about, and he hurried to his sister's room. The picture that appeared before Alex's eyes outraged him to the depths of his soul. Nina screamed at Renee and swung to hit her. Renee was getting ready to take the blow. Alexander didn't think about the consequences. In an instant, he found himself next to the women. The hand, already approaching the wife's face, was firmly intercepted. Her eyes flashed. Her lips harshly asked how long Nina had dared to behave like this. Nina did not expect Alexander to appear. Her anger gave way to confusion. Alex repeated his question, asking if she always behaved this way towards Renee. Nina tried to justify herself and said that this woman herself provoked her to aggression. Alex was outraged that Nina called Renee this woman. He said that if she continued in the same spirit, she would greatly regret it. Alexander pulled his stepsister's frail body towards him and asked her in a loud whisper to listen to him carefully. If Nina allows Alexander's anger to overcome his guilt towards her, he will strip her of the Chambler name. Then, Nina won't be able to live in the Chambler mansion, and her mother won't have the money to support her young lovers. Alexander promised to burn down their comfortable life, just as she had once burned down his. Nina was truly scared. Alex started talking about his mother's young lovers. But what does he really know? Alexander released Nina's hand and announced that she knew perfectly well that he would not repeat himself twice. The man hugged his wife and said he would take Renee to a room where she could calm down. The girl refused to go and announced that she had to take the cat from Nina's room. Alexander could not understand what Renee meant and what cat she was talking about. Nina stated that Renee was talking nonsense and that there was no cat in her room. What evidence did she have? Alexander really didn't like squabbles. Nina drove him crazy with her screams. Renee explained that Rain ran into Nina's room as soon as she opened the door to her knock, the cat looking for her kittens. Nina screamed again that Renee didn't dare search her room so late just for some kittens. Renee was persistent. She would just take Rain and leave immediately. She was not going to search anything. Renee pushed Nina, who was standing in her way, aside and quickly walked into the room. In vain did Nina and her maid try to stop Renee. The girl was determined to take her favorite back. Nina demanded that Renee leave her room and tried to grab her, but Alexander blocked her way. The girl saw that her cat was sitting by the window. Rain noticed her owner and meowed desperately, turning to the window. Renee realized that the cat could smell her kittens, but she couldn't figure out where they were. Renee looked out the window and noticed that there was a basket hanging on one of the branches of the tree growing outside the window, and the heads of 3 kittens were sticking out of it. The kittens were wet and cold. They screamed desperately and called for their mother cat. Renee was outraged. What was this, and who dared to do this? Had Nina really gone completely crazy? Nina tried to justify herself by saying that she had not noticed the kittens in the basket outside the window, and called her maid Melinda as a witness. Renee promised both of them that she would deal with them later. Now she needed to save the kittens. But Alexander did not allow her to climb out the window. The man took off his jacket and volunteered to get the kittens from the tree himself. Firstly, he was taller, and secondly, Renee would get wet and get sick. Alexander opened the window and climbed onto the windowsill. Even he had difficulty reaching the basket with the kittens. The Fluffies saw a familiar person and began to meow even louder. Now they had hope of salvation. Alex promised to deal with the person who had done this nasty thing. He reached out and took out the first kitten. The baby was completely frozen and wet, and without resistance, he walked into the man's arms. Alexander handed the kitten to Renee. She was standing near the window. The girl was worried about both the guy and the kittens. The first rescued one curled up in Renee's arms like a fluffy little ball, and the girl wondered why Alex was helping her. Just yesterday he was harsh and rude to her, and today he protected Nina, and now he is saving her kittens. What makes this person swing the pendulum of their relationship from deadly cold to scorching heat? When Alex acts like this, Renee is completely confused about his true intentions. Renee was briefly distracted from reality, automatically taking into her arms the kittens Alexander had saved. There was only one kitten left, the very last one, when suddenly the basket started to move. Alexander's foot slipped off the wet windowsill, and he fell down. Renee screamed desperately and tried to grab the man by the clothes, but it was all in vain. The vision was vivid, almost tangible. Alexander was again on a familiar beach, the ocean splashing at his feet, and Renee was sitting next to him. The girl was eating ice cream, chocolate, the most delicious one, and asking why Sasha was looking at her like that. Renee asked if Sasha wanted some ice cream too. It was delicious, and she could share it with him. Renee laughed. She saw only Sasha's lips. They were attractive and amazing. The guy had exactly the same thoughts. Renee and Sasha reached out to each other, and their lips touched, and the first kiss took place. Both decided that at 16, they were old enough to allow themselves this pleasure. Sasha decided that since Renee had kissed him, she shouldn't do it with any other guy. Renee hadn't thought about it at all, but just in case she was indignant at why Sasha had decided to control her life. The girl said that Sasha was delirious and had no right to tell her about it. People don't talk about things like that. Renee declared that she would decide for herself who she would kiss, threw down the ice cream, and ran away. As she ran, the girl shouted that she could let Sasha watch from the side as she kissed. The guy felt both funny and offended. But she was just a little pig. You can't laugh at his feelings like that. The rainbow memory was replaced by a bitter memory. A voice sounded in my head, accusing Sasha of abandoning his mother and having fun. The tragedy occurred only because Alexander did not stay with her, but preferred to have fun with his friend on the ocean shore. Alexander left his mother alone. He is an ungrateful son and a naughty boy. Alexander looked at his hands. Something strange was happening to his body. He was dissolving into the air, turning into gray smoke. The same voice rang in my head. First, Alexander drove his mother to the grave, and now he got to his father. The fire raged around. Now Alexander was in a burning house, and a voice shouted for the guy to look at the results of his deeds. The servants rushed around the burning mansion in search of the Marquise, but they were unable to reach Father Alexander. The man found himself in the very wing of the house that was most damaged by the fire. He was unable to escape. Everyone who lived in the burning house was able to escape from it, except for the Marquise himself. He died in the fire. The same voice kept hammering into the very subcortex. It was Alexander who killed his father, and he alone was to blame for his death. Despair overwhelmed Alex. It was he alone, who was to blame for the death of the people closest and dearest to him. He killed his father and mother. The voice was perplexed. And now he is going to ruin the life of Renee Haslin. Isn't that too many atrocities for one person? Through all these visions, Alexander heard Renee calling him and asking him to open his eyes and wake up. Alexander opened his eyes and saw Renee's face in front of him, full of anxiety and sympathy. Alexander whispered that he didn't want her to be unhappy, didn't want to hurt her. Alex wiped away her tears and told her that he should stop all this before Renee got hurt even more because of him. But what is this? His hand passed through the girl's body. Alexander didn't feel anything, he only saw. It was his bedroom, with a white canopy bed and equally snow-white curtains, perhaps too white. Alexander sat up in bed and looked around. The room was shining with a ghostly white light. Renee was sitting next to him, and he himself was lying in bed. The butler Gabriel entered and informed Renee that he had brought water and medicine for Monsieur Alexandre. Alexander stood next to Renee and looked at his own body in bewilderment. Was he sleeping or dead? Gabriel asked what condition his master was in, whether he had not yet come to his senses. Alexander saw everything and heard how Renee answered the butler that Alex was unconscious and was not going to wake up. Renee told Gabriel that she was very scared when Alex fell from the window, and the servants immediately appeared and urgently called a doctor. Alexander lay unconscious on the grass, and in his arms sat a fluffy kitten, safe and sound. Renee was glad that everything worked out, because it was summer and the grass was thick enough. Gabriel did not hide his joy that the kittens were safe, and Alexander had no serious injuries. All that remained was to wait. Alexander's pale body lay on the bed, his soul circling around and wondering whether to return or not. Gabriel calmed Renee, convincing him that everything would be fine, that the gentleman would definitely come to his senses and recover. The butler said that Alex had been a tough nut to crack since childhood, and that this was not the first time he had fallen out of a tree. The butler repeated once again that the mistress should rest and not worry so much, but Renee was beside herself with anxiety. The girl looked at Alice with love and said that he had called her Piglet since childhood, but he himself was constantly getting into various troubles. Renee didn't want to be discouraged and hoped that Sasha would soon come to his senses. He wasn't planning on leaving her as Shambler's widow. The girl asked Alex to come to his senses, and then they should stop arguing and finally talk calmly. Alexander's soul became curious, and she listened to Renee about what it was that she wanted to talk to him about. The spirit reached out to the girl's shoulder and tried to touch her, but the hand passed by again, as if they were in different realities. Renee asked why Alexander had not responded to her letter back in his distant youth. He had always said that he liked Renee and invited her to go on a trip with him. Even after so much time, the girl was still worried. The disappointment of her first love left deep wounds in her heart. Renee asked Alexander why he suddenly hated her, whether he really felt so bad, then that he hated the whole world. Alexander felt sorry for Renee. The girl looked genuinely upset. He wanted to tell her everything openly, but to do that, he would at least need to return to his body. The man wanted to explain to Renee that he never hated her, and that he was the only one to blame for what was happening. In fact, he only got involved with her because he needed her, and his youthful attachment only grew stronger over time. Alex wanted to tell her that before she became even more unhappy with him, before he became even more greedy, he had to take her back to that beautiful place. People didn't see what was happening. Only the kitten saved by Alexander looked in surprise at his owner's split personality. Alex's soul decided that it was too early for it to leave. It needed to stay and deal with the problems of this world. Renee couldn't be left alone now. The kitten continued to watch its owner. In its short cat life, it had never seen such a miracle. A serious scandal erupted in the mansion, and while Alexander was unconscious, Renee and her henchmen had to deal with the incident. The clear and resonant sound of heels echoed through the corridors of the mansion. It was the housekeeper, Andrea, heading to the servants' room. Andrea was looking for Rosa. She needed to find out from the girl the details of some events that had recently shaken the peaceful existence of the mansion. The housekeeper showed Rose several rather expensive things and asked if the girl knew who they belonged to. Rosa replied that these were the lady's things. Andrea confirmed that she was right. It was only surprising that they were found in Melinda's room. It is unclear how they got to her. Melinda could not enter either Rose's room or the owner's room. Could Rose explain anything to her? Rose, with tears in her eyes, swore that she had no idea where Melinda got these things from or why she needed them. Andrea didn't really believe her, but she had no direct evidence against Rosa. The housekeeper came to the conclusion that Rose had not been keeping her mistress's room in order and had been scattering her things around the house. She took away Rose's keys to the master bedroom. Rose realized that she had lost her mistress's trust and that the housekeeper suspected her. The girl was afraid of being left without a job. The housekeeper took the key and announced that she planned to search all the rooms where the servants lived. Most likely, more of the master's things would be found. Until all the culprits were found, all servants were forbidden to enter the Champler's bedroom without the personal permission of Madame Renee. Rose understood that her fate was hanging by a thread. If her connection with Mrs. Nina became known, she would simply be fired. A ray of sunlight hit the frame of the room in which Alexander was coming to his senses. The day clearly promised to be sunny. The beam moved from the frame to the bed, and then hit the patient straight in the eyes. Alex stirred and shielded himself from the sunlight with his hand. The sunbeam did not lag behind. It insisted on waking up, indignant that the young and strong man continued to bask in bed when he had so much to do. Alexander tried to raise his hand and open his eyes. It worked. His hands were tangible, and his body obeyed again. The man had to figure out whether he had returned to his mortal body or was still in an intermediate state. Alexander sat up in bed. Now the room was not shining with white light. Objects were real. Feelings returned. Alex remembered what had happened to him the day before. Whether it had really been just a dream. The upset Renee and his desire to calm and comfort her. The man did not expect that he could dream of such a thing. He was not inclined to mysticism and did not believe in the transmigration of souls and other fables. On the bed next to him, Alexander found the culprit of his fall. The gray kitten had not wanted to leave his savior in recent days. Alex picked up the kitten and asked how he was feeling, and if everything was okay with the fluffy one. The kitten purred and rubbed its head against Alexander's hands, glad that nothing bad had happened to either of them. The little gray rascal decided that he could do anything now, and tried to climb onto Alexander's shoulder. The man accidentally looked into the kitten's eyes, and a feeling of déjà vu came over him. It was these very eyes, this very cat, that he had seen in a recent dream. The cat looked at its owner with the all-understanding and all-forgiving gaze of an animal, wise in its experience of communicating with the other world. The door of the room opened. The butler appeared on the threshold. He saw that Alexander had woken up and was very happy about it. Gabriel was glad that the owner was okay. He asked if the owner was in any pain and what he should get him. Alexander asked how long he had been unconscious, and the butler replied that it had been about 3.5 days. Alexander ordered that the newspapers and letters that had accumulated during this time be brought to him, and that he be served whiskey with ice. Gabriel tried to object that doctors did not recommend that the owner drink after such a long illness. Alexander tried to object. He said that he appreciated the butler's concern, but whiskey always helped him best with headaches, so let him bring it faster. An enraged Renee burst into the room. She had accidentally overheard Alex's words and was now burning with righteous anger. The girl was indignant. Alexander fell from such a height and barely survived. He just opened his eyes and asked for a drink. This is on the border between good and evil. Alexander was confused and wondered what had suddenly happened to his always docile and pliable fictitious wife. Renee ordered Gabriel not to give the owner any alcohol under any circumstances, to immediately call Dr. Lopez, and ordered that something light be served. The butler did not dare argue with Renee, and the girl immediately decided to examine the patient herself in case he had a fever. Renee determined that Alex's temperature was now normal, but he was currently not allowed to drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes until the doctor lifted the ban. Renee was adamant that when one person apologizes to another, They should at least pretend to be sorry. Alexander couldn't understand what the girl meant. The man hadn't yet fully recovered from waking up. Renee asked if he would say again that his health was none of her business, and she didn't know her place. Alexander thought he remembered Renee's upset face, which she had in that vision or reality of his. Alex pretended to be very upset that he was not allowed to drink, and said that he would only agree to it on one condition. Renee clarified what exact condition Alex had come up with. The girl expected a catch from him. She had known this man for too long. Alexander assumed that he should probably get a reward for saving her precious cats, since it involved risking his life. Alex solemnly promised not to drink or smoke, but only if Renee went on a date with him. The girl expected any condition, but not this one. Alexander invites her on a date. Where's the catch? Alexander asked why Renee was so surprised by his proposal. He was simply asking her to have dinner with him somewhere. Renee stared at her fictitious husband and first love, torn by doubts. What has this man come up with? Is he being honest, or is he preparing another relationship pendulum for her so that life won't be a bed of roses? Alexander insisted. She herself said that he miraculously survived, so in return, he had the right to demand at least a joint dinner. Renee received a letter from her uncle. He asked how she was doing and whether she had settled into the city. Thanks to her, everything was fine at the orphanage, and the number of children had increased. There were now 30 pupils, but Renee need not worry. They could cope with such a number of children quite well. The uncle said that he wanted to take in another child who had an eye problem and needed medical help. This is a smart, capable, sincere, and strong boy. It's time for him to become independent, and his uncle asked for help finding him a job and helping with treatment. The uncle reported that the boy's name was Gord Ryle and asked Renee to take care of him. Renee was indignant. How could they send a child like that without warning? Renee didn't read the letter until the afternoon, so Gordon had to wait a long time in the reception area. Renee was annoyed with her uncle. He could have warned her earlier, apologized to Gordon for the delay, and asked how he was doing. Renee asked Gordon to tell her what happened to his eye. She needed to know which doctor to make an appointment with, and how urgently. Gordon said that he was injured in a fight, but it was not a simple prank. Madame Renee must definitely believe him. Gordon said that about 2 years ago, the shelter became crowded and restless. At night, when he was going to the toilet, he saw 2 unknown men enter the women's dormitory and followed them. It turned out that these bastards wanted to have fun with one of the girls. Gordon got into a fight with them, and as a result, his eye was damaged. One of the attackers hit him hard in the face, and since then, the eye on that side has been seeing worse and worse. Proud felt a little awkward bothering Madame Renee. He was just unlucky. But if everything were to happen again, he would still follow the men. All the girls remained safe and sound. They were a little scared, but that's nothing, and he hopes to heal his eye. Renee looked at the boy with admiration. He was still so young, but already had the character of a real man. It was surprising that Gordon called what happened to him just bad luck. Renee realized that there was a very good person standing in front of her, and she simply had to help him. Renee promised to immediately start looking for a hospital where Gordon could get help and asked if the guy had a place where he could stay. Gordon was at a loss. He had nowhere to stay and absolutely no money to rent an apartment. Renee understood everything. Her uncle was in his element. He seemed to believe that all people in the world help each other simply out of the kindness of their hearts. The naivety of her relative irritated Renee. It wasn't about the cost of Gordon's treatment or the boy's housing costs. It was just that it was all unexpected. Renee's company took up all the girls' free time. She needed to establish herself in Kaliva, expand sales, and find good suppliers. The marriage contract between Renee and Alexander was inexorably coming to an end. Time was running out like wine from a broken glass, no longer slowly and surely, but quickly and hopelessly. Will Renee's business be able to stay afloat and become a sales leader if her uncle continues to run the orphanage so recklessly? Renee wouldn't exactly be upset. She was just looking for a way out of the situation. She would, of course, come up with something. Renee chuckled. Her uncle probably just didn't take it into account. But Gordon really shouldn't be upset. Renee decided to found her own company so that she would have money to support children from the orphanage who found themselves in difficult situations. Renee convinced Gordon that he shouldn't worry about anything, and she decided that she would simply try her best to keep things moving forward. The first thing Renee decided to do was go into the city and find a suitable apartment for Gordon. The guy had to live somewhere. There was whispering in the mansion. Some were happy, some were angry and afraid. But the news was bombshell. Renee threw Nina out. Alexander's grandmother was delighted with her grandson's wife. Renee booked a hotel and sent Miss Nina there along with her maid Melinda. Alexander doubted that Nina had left without a scandal. It was not in this woman's nature to give in to anyone. The butler said that Nina screamed until the very end, that she had been slandered and framed. But Madame Renee was adamant, and then Nina slapped Renee on the cheek. Alexander couldn't contain his anger and indignation. After all, Nina always overestimated her position in his house, and now her behavior was completely out of line. The butler recalled how ugly the whole scene was. Nina shouting at Renee that she was a nobody and had no name, and therefore he couldn't kick her out of the mansion. Renee stated that if Nina continued to scream and use her hands, she would be forced to hand her over to the police. Renee cannot punish Nina for cruelty to animals, but theft of things has been established, and for this, Nina and Melinda could get real prison time. Nina may not be aware, but there is a lot of evidence against Melinda, and if anything, neither of them will be able to get out of prison anytime soon. If Nina doesn't want to leave the mansion for a hotel, then Renee can arrange for her to stay in a bed in a place not so remote. Nina couldn't stand the nervous tension and decided that she could embarrass and defeat Renee if she hit her on the cheek. Renee recoiled. Despite the pain, Nina had strong hands, and she put all her hatred for her brother's wife into the slap. Renee grabbed her cheek. It hurt, but the girl was not going to give in to this evil fury who had been ruining her life for 2 years. The servants were shocked. They had never seen anything like this. For many, it looked like legal retribution for all their suffering. Renee didn't take long to think or reason. She swung and hit Nina so hard that she almost fell off her feet. Nina didn't expect to get a rebuff from her brother's wife. Until now, Renee had behaved quietly and hadn't gone into any obvious conflict. Renee folded her hands formally on her hips and told Nina that she was forgetting a very important point. When you hit someone, you need to be prepared for the fact that they will hit you back. Nina screamed that Renee Hazel had no right to be in charge of this house and to drive out its rightful owners. Renee replied that she was actually Renee Chambler and that Nina was not the owner of this house, but only a quarrelsome parasite and freeloader. The girl said that she does not call Alex's half-sister Nina Anasia, although she actually bears that last name. Renee was adamant that if Nina wanted to continue being called Chambler, she had to move out of the mansion and respect her daughter-in-law. If Nina dares to spread false rumors about Reina, she will hold her accountable not only for theft, but also for slander. The butler recounted with pleasure that Madame Renee looked determined and formidable. It was the first time in 2 years that he had seen her like this. Alexander was glad to hear that Renee had finally become exactly the way he remembered her from childhood. The guy remembered that the Renee he knew had no intention of letting go of insults, even to very close people. He himself often got it from her. Alexander was only surprised that Renee was able to hold out for 2 whole years and endure all of Nina's bullying and whims. Grandma was pleased. Nina did cruel things, and even dragged Sasha into it. Renee dealt with her perfectly, a real mistress of the house. Alexander looked at his grandmother, with understanding, and a cunning plan formed in his head. He asked the butler to make a list of the things that Melinda had stolen. Alex clarified that the current commissioner of the Royal Police is still Count Handstring. He is not mistaken. The butler confirmed that this was indeed the case, and that this count was a friend of the Admiral and the great Madame Chambler. To Alex's surprise, the butler reminded him that the salon his grandmother had run in her youth was incredibly popular, and that Madame had great connections. Grandma smiled sadly. All this is true, but it is already such a distant past that it is not worth remembering. Alexander remembered being told that in ancient times, the scale of any social gathering in Kalaiva was determined by the presence of his grandmother. Once upon a time, Granny was an incredible beauty, the center of social circles and a close friend of the Queen. This brilliant woman eclipsed everyone with her presence. Now she is ill, but traces of her former beauty and stature are visible in her appearance. Tragic events in her life have greatly undermined this woman. A fire in which her son died, and her grandson was blamed, has completely deprived her of strength and health. Alexander thought deeply. Maybe in fact he was not so much to blame for everything. Maybe he should take the blame for everything in the world. After falling from the window and that unreal dream, so similar to true events, Alexander greatly changed his opinion about his place in life. Alex stood up resolutely and said that he completely agreed with his wife regarding Nina. If she returned to the estate again, he would throw her out. The grandmother realized that her grandson was getting ready to leave and was upset. But Alex had not been at work for a long time, and business required his presence. Grandma wished her grandson good health and asked him to visit her more often. Alex apologized for causing her so much trouble. The formidable owner of factories and steamships, as well as diamond placers, returned to his office. A lot of work had indeed accumulated. Alexander wanted to take advantage of the solitude and relax a little. His hand reached for the box of cigars. Instead of the expected cigars, Alex found several candies and an intricately folded piece of paper in the drawer. It was a note from Renee. Alexander didn't know whether to be happy or sad. On the one hand, he really wanted to smoke, but on the other, he was touched by Renee's sincere concern. Renee wrote that she had prepared these candies as a medicine for a patient who would break his promise. But it was better for him to eat the candies. They tasted like whiskey. The signature on the note was very simple. From your wife. Alexander buried his nose in the paper and made several very strange sounds. The butler became alarmed and asked the gentleman what had happened, whether he had received disturbing news or whether trouble had visited them again. The servant was ready for anything. Recently, his master's family had been shaken by various storms, and the man lived in fear for the future. Imagine Gabriel's surprise when he realized that his master was laughing loudly and openly. He hadn't seen Alex like this since the day his mother died. Along this avenue, there is a book district and several newspaper publishing houses. Scientists live here, and there is never any disorder. Renee took Gordon to a decent part of the city, where he could rent a good apartment for a reasonable price. The guy was surprised. It was the first time he had seen so many cars and people. The big city made a stunning impression on him. Renee replied that she too was very surprised by everything in Kaliva when she first arrived there. The girl took a piece of paper out of her bag, on which she wrote down the address of the office she needed. Renee got distracted, and completely by chance, collided with a young man who was in a hurry about his business. The piece of paper fell from Renee's hands and landed on the pavement, and the wind immediately carried it away from the passers-by. The person who caused the collision apologized and quickly caught the sheet of paper that had fallen from Renee's hands. The girl felt uncomfortable and needed to be more careful. Unexpectedly, the stranger turned out to be the same Mr. Littrey whom Renee met at the reception at college. The guy also recognized her. Mr. Littrey was glad to meet Mrs. Chambler, although he had not expected to meet her on this particular street. In his opinion, such a refined and beautiful woman did not fit into the business world of this neighborhood. Renee introduced Littrey Gordon as her firm's newest employee and said they had come to find him a place to live. Mr. Littrey thought it was very nice that the head of the company cared about his employees. This guy must be a very valuable asset. Renee said that Gordon was the best student at the orphanage where Littrey worked as a volunteer, and her company was created to help children from the orphanage. Littrey was surprised that she had created a company for children. Renee replied that she considered herself responsible not only for the orphanage, but also for the future of her charges. Orphanage children are inexperienced and have difficulty finding their place in life, so she tries to create jobs for them. Renee announced that Gordon would be working in her company. The boy was happy and said that he would try very hard and make every effort. Mr. Littrey was impressed by Mrs. Chambler's intentions and her selfless dedication to the orphanage and the children. Mr. Littrey realized from his first visit to the orphanage that Mrs. Renee had a wonderful relationship with the children and that she was an amazing woman. Renee was pleased to hear words of gratitude from a stranger. Littrey decided to contribute to a good cause and offered Gordon to live in one of his company's office rooms, which was located very close by. Renee objected. She could not burden Mr. Littrey, but the young man insisted on providing Gordon with this housing. Littrey asked not to worry. The room had long been vacant, and he was looking for a tenant. This would be his gesture of gratitude to the great heart of Mrs. Chambler. Mr. Littrey said that Renee might think he was a selfish plagiarist who was trying to be as wonderful as she was. Renee was glad that the issue with Gordon's apartment was resolved quickly and painlessly. Renee and Gordon were grateful to Litri for his kindness and help in finding an apartment. Mr. Litri suggested taking a look at the apartment in case Gordon or Mrs. Renee didn't like it. Litri said that the apartment was located very close by, and they could inspect it right now. Chatting cheerfully, Renee, Litri, and Gordon went to inspect the boys' future place of residence. All three of them could not even suspect that they were being followed. An unknown person caught Renee and Litri in the lens of a camera and took a photo. Almost immediately, the paparazzi took a photo of Renee laughing. The camera allowed him to capture the girl from a very close angle. The paparazzi was pleased with his work. The photos turned out high quality, and he could count on a reward. Renee, Litri, and Gordon went to look at the apartment. They were cheerful and carefree, unaware of the danger hanging over Renee. It was getting dark. The light had already been turned on in Renee's office. Modern lighting, stylized as candles, was the latest fashion. The girl looked through the bills sent from the shelter, a meticulous and pointless task. It was stupid to double-check the financial state of the shelter after the accountant, which is what Renee had even hoped to find. The shelter was absorbing all of the company's money, and Renee was unlikely to be able to stabilize the situation before the divorce. Alexander's footsteps were heard. He approached Renee and asked what was bothering her and why she was sitting at work so late. Alexander was indignant that Renee did not allow him to work late, declaring that she was still sick, while she herself was ready to balance the accounts until the morning. This fact outraged Alexander to the depths of his soul, and he demanded that Renee go to the bedroom and go to bed. Renee was confused. She did not expect such pressure from her future ex-husband. Alexander looked at the papers and decided that her concerns concerned the shelter. At first, Renee wanted to send Alex away and not tell him anything about the state of affairs at the shelter. But she thought that this didn't concern her. But the children, if Renee didn't find a way to earn money, then they would all end up on the street. Renee knew very well that Alexander was a successful businessman, and that under his patronage, the shelter could count on the support of other wealthy people. The girl decided to put aside her pride and at least get advice from him on how to best run the company's affairs. Renee explained that she was in a difficult situation because the shelter's expenses were growing faster than her company's income. The girl asked what Alexander would advise to do in such a situation. Maybe he had a guide to action. Alexander did not expect such a question from his wife. Renee is an amazing woman after all. Alex joked that if Mrs. Hazelin herself asked him, he wouldn't dare refuse her advice. Alex assured Renee that in life everything is like in a casino. To increase your winnings, you need to raise the stakes. There's no point in just sitting around waiting for sales to grow in the current market. Renee's company has already reached from Whitehall to Kaliva. Now it needs to move on. Of course, everything depends on the product. You can increase investments in advertising and emphasize its exclusivity, but entering new markets is more profitable. Renee jumped at the idea. Maybe she could really try to expand her sales market. Until now, the girl had only been involved with shops in Kaliva, but it seemed it was time to move to other cities. Alexander chuckled. Of course she needs to find investors, but he doesn't think it will be too difficult for her. Renee looked at Alex carefully, wondering if he was really thinking about what she wanted to ask him herself. The girl smiled. It seemed that Providence had taken pity on the orphans, but Renee did not want to depend on this man. Renee thanked Alexander for the offer, but she had to refuse it. She couldn't. She couldn't rely on him forever. Very soon they will separate, become complete strangers, and then Renee will no longer have anyone to count on. That's why Renee believed, and immediately told Alex, that she needed to look for other ways to earn money. The girl tried to put the papers in the folder, but the firm merged hand did not allow her to do so. Alexander objected that she didn't have to end everything so abruptly. He could calmly continue to support the shelter. Renee didn't understand why he needed this. They would soon get divorced anyway, and it would be pointless for him to support Hazel's orphanage. Renee couldn't stand it any longer, and told Alex that his behavior had been bothering her for a long time, and that he was simply thrown from one extreme to another. At first, Alex takes revenge on her offender, but then reminds Renee of her real place, and a little later, risking his life, he climbs to save her cats. Now, Alexander suddenly announces that he is going to support the shelter even after the divorce. How should Renee understand this? Alexander stated that there was nothing to understand here. He was simply doing what he liked at any given moment. He stood up for her out of a sense of justice. He simply didn't like the way Nina and Lorraine were behaving, but he would have stood up for anyone. As for the shelter, you shouldn't expect anything special from it, and right now, it doesn't cost him that much money to maintain it. Alex added that charity is trendy now, and by donating money to her shelter, he would at least be sure that the money was going to orphans. Renee agreed that Alex was reasoning quite rationally and asked permission to ask another question about why he had returned. For so long, Alexander had been pushing her away, abandoning her, and suddenly, after quite a long time, he came and, as if nothing had happened, proposed marriage. Alexander replied that he simply needed a fictitious wife for business reasons, but so that everyone would consider her real. Renee felt a sense of déjà vu as Alex approached her once again, trying to gain her trust and gain her goodwill. While Renee resists and convinces him that she doesn't need anything, that she can handle it herself, Alexander increases the pressure. It's worth showing even a little bit of a good attitude and a willingness to take a step towards each other, and Alex distances himself from Renee. The girl grabbed the obstinate Marquise by the hand and asked him why he had chosen her as his fictitious wife, and why he had chosen her. Renee demanded that Alexander admit that it was her he wanted to see as his wife, albeit a fictitious one. The hammers in the boy's head started pounding again, and joyful and tragic images of his childhood and youth flashed before his eyes. The first thing he saw was 11-year-old Renee, the very day they first met. Then he remembered the day of their first kiss, and her lips, still tasting like chocolate vanilla ice cream. Renee, laughing and happy. That's how he remembered her. That's how she was that last summer, the day before everything happened because of Alexander, and his life ended. This time the vision didn't end. Renee appeared in front of him, persuading him not to die after he fell out of the window. The girl held Alexander's hand tightly and waited for an answer. He turned around and replied that she was right. He missed her. Even though Renee had guessed this, she didn't expect such an answer from Alexander here and now. Alexander said that he didn't have the courage to apologize for the past, so he used the ridiculous excuse of marriage to bring her to his place. Alex said all this and looked straight into Renee's face, but his words sounded somehow too harsh. He laughed evilly. She wanted to hear it. Alexander's face was too close, and it was driving Renee crazy, so she didn't immediately hear the evil irony in the man's words. Alexander chuckled harshly, asking why Renee was so curious, and why she desperately wanted to know the answer to this particular question. The man claimed that they were no longer the same as they had been before, that what had happened to them in the past did not matter now. And did it really matter to her? The girl replied that he didn't think her question was legitimate, since it was obvious that she would someday dare to ask about it. Alexander hovered over Renee, so close and yet so far away, and asked if, after everything she had heard, she was still interested in him, if she truly loved him. Alex laughed. Did he really love her? Then he would say what interested him now, something that a provincial girl from Whitehall would never understand in her entire life. Instead of words, Alexander pressed his lips harshly against hers. He did not caress. There was no love in his kiss, only an evil unceremoniousness. The kiss went on and on. Renee had no physical strength to resist, and she simply curled up into a ball, waiting for this torture to end. Alex released her lips, and the girl tried to push the guy away, persuading him to let her go. Alexander let go and asked why she was resisting so aggressively, if this wasn't exactly what she wanted. Renee was outraged and declared that Alexander Chandler was a real scoundrel if he was capable of such actions. What does love have to do with it? Renee was angry. She has no right to ask this question, which he himself avoids. If everything is nonsense for him, then why is he silent? Alexander stated that he simply did not want to answer her this question. It was none of her business. She was feeding her precious orphans, and let her be content with that. Alexander had never seen his old friend so furious before. The girl grabbed the guy by the lapel of his shirt, first shook him hard, and then pulled him towards her with all her strength. Taken by surprise, Alexander obeyed the movement of her hands and leaned straight towards her face. A second later, their lips met and they were kissing again. This time, Renee was the first violinist, and the kiss was more tender and soft. The lips parted, but Alexander didn't have time to say anything before Renee's hands pressed hard against his chest. Renee threw Alexander away from her. The man fully felt both the strength of her arms and the seriousness of her intentions. "If that's what we're talking about," Renee chuckled, "then she already knows enough. But it's unlikely that an ordinary village girl will be able to satisfy him on this issue." The girl turned and resolutely walked out of the office, slamming the door furiously as she finished. Renee's behavior shocked Alexander, although what else could he have expected? And as a child, she was all about sharp edges. Alexander's fists clenched. He thought his wife was a naive girl, but judging by the last kiss, this was not entirely true. Renee knew how to kiss, and this discovery baffled Alexander. Today, Renee wore her best shoes. The heels made her look taller and more graceful, and the occasion required her to comply with the most demanding dress code. Renee followed the imposing maid across the graceful bridge over the Lotus Lake and stopped, awaiting further instructions. The servant reported to the Queen that Mrs. Chandler had arrived at Her Majesty's invitation. The Queen was drinking tea with a royal person like herself, but from another country, Renee was expected here, since the table was set for 3 people. Queen Laverta, Mary Katharina, Alice Hendrick greeted Mrs. Chandler and inquired about her affairs. Renee bowed to Her Majesty and replied that thanks to her care, she lived comfortably. The Queen warmly received Renee and invited the girl to the table. Renee willingly accepted the royal invitation. The Queen introduced Renee to her niece from Phillips, Mrs. Arch Rhodes Maximute. Arch said she was pleased to meet Mrs. Chandler. The royal niece thought Renee looked even more beautiful than she imagined her. Renee replied that their highnesses were very kind to her and that it was a great honor for her to meet with royal persons. Arch said that she had asked the Queen to arrange a meeting for them because she really wanted to meet Renee Chandler. Renee was perplexed. She could not even imagine that her modest person would arouse the interest of the princess of a neighboring state. Arch reminded Renee that last year, when her sister visited their country, Renee gave her some bars of soap. Last year, Renee just started promoting her own soaps, adding aromatic oils to them and packaging them beautifully. When meeting with high-ranking guests in an informal setting, Renee always gave them soap selected to suit their taste. Since Renee had read that Princess Phillips was picky about cosmetics, Renee approached the making of the soap that was given to them very carefully. Princess Arch said that she and her sister had suffered from skin problems since childhood, and nothing could help them. When her sister brought Renee's soap to Philly, Arch didn't pay any attention to it, but she tried it once, and now she doesn't need any other soap. That's why Arch came here just to meet Ren in person and buy more of this soap. Renee was pleased to hear high praise for her product and said that she would be happy to give Arch as much soap as she wanted. The princess was grateful, but that was not what she meant. She offered to launch the soap that Renee made in the department stores of her native Phillips. The princess had no doubt about Renee's success and promised to provide any necessary support. Arch said that she wanted to receive this soap in the required quantity without delays and to be aware of all the new products. For this, Renee should deliver it to Phillips. The princess was sure that Renee's soap would gain enormous popularity in her country. Renee had no right to sell such a wonderful product only in Kaliva. The Queen tried to calm her niece, who agreed. Her behavior was justified only by her admiration for Renee's goods. The Queen concluded that Arch's proposal seemed sudden to Renee, but the Queen did not consider it bad. It would help spread Renee's goods throughout the world. The Queen and Princess asked Renee to consider their proposals and not refuse. Renee left the audience thinking that she had been offered the opportunity to expand her business, and to another country at that, a good offer. The girl remembered how her husband recommended that she raise the stakes to increase her chances of winning. This was a unique opportunity, and the princess herself was willing to be an investor, so she wouldn't have to turn to Alexander. Yesterday's events came back to her mind and made her cheeks turn pink. Alexander asked her if she loved him and kissed her. Remembering this, my lips still began to throb slightly. Renee forced herself not to think about it and to focus on business. Trying to calm her wild thoughts, Renee quietly made her way to the office of Chandler and Company. The office was a huge high-rise building with an elevator and arched windows, glass doors leading visitors into the quiet of the hall. Renee looked at the office building with indecision. And why was she so afraid, in fact? She owned some part of this building. Could yesterday's incident be the cause of Renee's indecision and shyness? Here, Renee discovered that Alexander's car was parked near the building. She couldn't have been mistaken. No one else had one like it. The girl was not ready to meet her future ex-husband and immediately moved behind the fountain. Here, on a small, quiet bench, she hid behind a newspaper and decided to wait until Alexander went inside the building. The employees met the boss and, on the way, brought him up to date on the events that had taken place at his enterprises during his absence. Renee occasionally glanced back at Alexander and waited impatiently for him to go inside the building so as not to catch his eye. Alex felt uncomfortable. He felt like he was being watched, and he began to look around him. Alexander carefully examined the surroundings, but could not see anything suspicious. He was asked what was the matter. Alexander replied that it seemed to him that his wife was somewhere nearby. Renee, hiding behind a thin sheet of newspaper, heard Alex's conversation with the employees. She began to be tormented by the question of how he found out about this. Alexander looked around carefully again, but still didn't see Renee. The man was in a hurry to get things done and decided that it was just his imagination. Renee sat quietly on the bench behind the fountain and was glad that Alexander was so absent-minded. The girl didn't want to meet this man so much that she was ready to crawl under a bench just so he wouldn't see her. Renee was surprised at how much her behavior did not correspond to the status of a respectable married lady. The girl was outraged at herself, saying that she had reached such a level. The girl, burning with shame, decided that she needed to go home. She stood up from the bench and took a few uncertain steps. The shoes were too new, and this model was not at all suitable for walking around the city. As a result, Renee got blisters on her feet. Renee was upset. Her feet hurt in her shoes. She just needed to take the car, but she sent the driver home so she could walk. Renee slowly walked towards the house, and suddenly she felt a passerby tug hard at her handbag. Renee raised her head. She decided that she had met someone she knew, and that someone was calling her that way, trying to bring her out of her reverie. The girl did not expect such behavior from anyone on the street, and dropped her bag out of surprise. Renee immediately came to her senses and shouted that her bag had been stolen, and that the thief needed to be apprehended. The girl screamed help so loudly that it was hard not to hear her. She screamed at the top of her lungs and at the same time tried to catch up with the robber. The shoes were too tight, and it was terribly uncomfortable for her to run in them, and that was the only reason the bandit ran away from her. Renee couldn't allow this particular bag to be stolen from her. It contained very important papers. The queen gave the girl a letter for Alexander's grandmother, Lady Josie, and Renee could not afford to lose it. The queen told the girl that Lady Josie had been her dear friend for many years. Renee received this message with trepidation and promised to deliver it safe and sound. The queen was worried about Lady Josie. She heard that she had been feeling unwell lately. Renee didn't see much of a problem in handing over this letter. But now some guy was attempting not only on the queen's letter, but also on Renee's reputation. Renee desperately called for help, begging one of the passers-by to detain this nasty guy. Suddenly, Renee had an assistant. A young man suggested that Renee catch the thief and take his bag from him. The girl did not recognize the assistant at first glance, but she watched with impatience and sympathy as he set off in pursuit of the thief. Renee was breathing heavily. Her legs were aching. She was thinking only bad things about herself, how stupid and useless she was. You don't wander around the streets with letters from royalty. If she received something so important, she should have gone straight home, but she was in the clouds. Scary thoughts came into her head that she wouldn't be able to find her bag. Suddenly, an unfamiliar male hand extended to her the precious lost thing. Renee looked at her savior with gratitude. Now she was ready to do anything for this man. It turned out that her savior was none other than Mr. Ripley, a young man who happened to be next to Renee. The girl was too happy to think about her bruised legs or suspect this wonderful man of anything. A few minutes earlier, a stylishly dressed woman had pointed out Renee to a street thief. The unknown woman ordered the man to wait for a convenient moment and take the bag from this young lady. He was supposed to give her only the key, and the lady allowed him to take everything else he found in this bag, all the money and valuables, as payment for the service. The lady miscalculated. Mr. Ripley appeared unexpectedly, and the tramp was captured thanks to the speed and dexterity of the young man. Ripley knocked the attacker down and twisted his arms. It seemed that all was lost for the unknown lady, and she would not receive her coveted key. The bandit was not going to miss the opportunity to make money, He quietly found the treasured key in her purse, which the customer needed so much. With an imperceptible movement of the hand, the key migrated to the tramp's sleeve. He completed the task, and the rest was a matter of time. The police were already rushing to Ripley's aid. They asked how the gentleman was feeling, and Ripley replied that he had detained a thief. The police tied up the tramp. He had no chance to break free or escape. Banit was angry. A good catch had slipped away from him, and he would even be taken to the police station. But he still snatched something, and there was hope of profiting. One of the police officers took the bandit to the station, and the second went to talk to the victim. The key from the bandit's sleeve fell onto the sidewalk, and it's strange that none of the police noticed it. A woman's hand in a snow-white blouse quickly picked up the treasured key, and just as quickly disappeared from the scene. The unknown lady held the coveted item in her hands and watched with fear as the police officers took away her performer. Ripley hurried to Renee. The young man asked if everything was okay with her and how she ended up in this part of the city. Renee was scared, but luckily Ripley was in the right place at the right time and returned her purse. She was grateful to him. A police officer ran up and asked about the victim's well-being. Renee and Ripley reassured the officer. Renee was fine. The policeman was grateful to Ripley for apprehending the thief. He praised the gentleman for running fast. This helped them all a lot. Ripley understood the importance of his action, but was still a little embarrassed. He asked Renee to check if all the things in her bag were in place. The girl opened her purse and quickly examined its contents. The letter was her most valuable asset, and she checked for its presence first. Renee examined the letter from all sides. It was not damaged at all, and this brought the girl great relief. Renee thanked Mr. Ripley again. If it weren't for him, the bag and letter would have disappeared without a trace, and Renee's situation would have become difficult. The police officer was relieved when they told him that nothing was missing from the bag. He took Renee's address and said that she would be called to the police station in a few days. Ripley noticed Renee's feet. In an unsuccessful attempt to catch up with the thief, the girl broke her heels and lost her shoes. Now, Renee was standing in the middle of the street barefoot and clearly feeling uncomfortable. Ripley asked her to wait on the nearest bench. Renee had no choice but to follow the guy's advice. She sat down on a bench and tried to enjoy the surrounding view. It was good that the weather was warm, and Mr. Ripley returned quickly. He resolved all the issues with the police and came to Renee not empty-handed. Mr. Ripley brought Renee a rather nice pair of women's shoes and offered to try them on. If these didn't fit, he was prepared to go for another pair. Renee was grateful to this young man. She liked his ability to appear at the right time, in the right place. The girl asked where Ripley got these cute ladies' shoes, and how, by the way. The man realized that he needed shoes. Ripley replied that there was a good ladies' shoe store nearby, and he couldn't allow the beautiful Mrs. Renee to walk home barefoot. The girl put on the shoes, and surprisingly, they fit her perfectly. The leather was soft, and the shoe last was comfortable. Renee was touched. How lovely! Her poor legs finally felt good and calm. Renee thanked Ripley and promised to pay him back. The man claimed that she owed him nothing and that any gentleman would have done the same in his place. Ripley was worried about Renee's well-being and offered to take her home. The girl turned out to be a police officer who had already contacted the estate, and a car would be arriving for her soon. Ripley suggested that Renee wait for the car at his travel agency, which was located in a building nearby. The girl readily accepted the invitation from the travel agency. It was so exciting. She had always dreamed of traveling. Ripley led Renee to a large and beautiful building, the first floor of which housed his travel agency. Renee loved everything about Ripley's office, and she was fascinated by the ancient maps on the walls and the exotic souvenirs from different countries. Ripley suggested that the girl look through the tour brochures. Renee was interested in the deserts. She had heard that it was incredibly hot there. Renee asked if Ripley Livis had been to the desert, and the man replied that he personally checks all tours before offering them to clients. Levis said he first tests several routes and then creates the optimal plan for the client's journey. The man spoke enthusiastically, showing everything on the map. Here is Le Verde. If Renee sets sail on a yacht from the capital's main port, then in a few days she will find herself in the very same desert whose photographs she had just looked at. Renee joined in the discussion, asking with interest how long the journey would take and how he planned to move through the desert. Ripley replied that the journey would take about 2 months by fast passenger ship and about 2 weeks by train. Renee could already imagine herself on the deck of a ship. Even 2 months wouldn't be scary to her. She would happily sail across the boundless ocean to unknown lands. The girl dreamed of traveling to another country. She wanted to see exotic landscapes, get to know a different culture and different people. Ripley said that the desert night sky surpasses all imagination. People travel for different reasons, some out of curiosity, others for relaxation. There are people, Levis reasoned, who travel to distant lands just to escape reality. Renee listened and absent-mindedly spun the globe. She would really like to escape from her current reality. Too many problems had piled up. The girl was taken aback by Levis's question about why she would like to go traveling. The dreams collapsed, and the girl returned to the harsh reality of today. No matter what her reasons for traveling, she simply cannot go. Levis was upset and asked why. She was so young, beautiful, rich, and could not afford the pleasure of seeing other countries. Renee explained that for her, traveling is a luxury she can't afford. And it's not about money. She has too many things to do and responsibilities. Renee needs to keep track of things at the shelter. Her uncle can't handle it alone, and she has no one to trust with this matter. The financial situation of her soap business leaves much to be desired, but sales are only just beginning to gain momentum. Renee thought about Alex and evasively noted that she still had a lot of things to get in order. Moreover, in order to decide to travel, a girl needs to muster up courage, which she doesn't have and can't get anywhere. However, if she were ever able to go on a trip, she would like to go to a place that she cannot even imagine. Ripley Leverous was delighted with Mrs. Renee. He had rarely met such a beautiful and thoughtful woman. Leverous asked Renee to let him give her a globe as a gift. Having such an object in her room would ensure that she would never forget her dreams. Ripley was sure that one day Mrs. Renee would be able to go on a trip. It was not such a grandiose undertaking as it might seem. Leverous hoped that one day Renee would be able to put all her problems aside and visit the places on the planet that she liked. And this gift, according to the man, should remind her of traveling and encourage her to do so. Renee accepted the gift from Leverous with great gratitude. The man gave it from the bottom of his heart, wishing the girl only the best. The boss's office and the entire building of Chandler's company shook from Alexander's scream. The reason for his dissatisfaction was not at all the company's affairs. Alex scolded his secretary for being late in informing him that Renee had been attacked by a pickpocket and that it had happened right in front of their company's central office. The secretary made excuses. He wanted to come in and report, but Alexander ordered him not to interrupt the meeting and threw him out. Alexander cursed even more, and if a war had started, the secretary would have remained silently waiting, only because he was told not to come in, or something like that. The secretary was frightened and confused. He justified himself by saying that he had been informed that the criminal had been caught immediately and that nothing terrible had happened. Alexander did not answer anything, only instructed the secretary to make sure that the meeting minutes were drawn up correctly and stated that he was going home immediately. The boss's behavior shocked the subordinate to the depths of his soul. He had never seen him like this before. Alexander didn't go home even when they asked him to leave work, and now he rushed off without even finishing the meeting, and all because of his wife. The secretary remembered the tense expression on his boss's face and decided that he was very worried about his wife. Alexander forgot about both the secretary and the meeting. He rushed headlong into the courtyard, got into the car, and ordered the driver to immediately take him to the mansion. The mansion greeted Alexander with silence and calm, but this did not subside the man's anxiety, but rather increased it. The housekeeper met the gentleman in the hall without greeting him. Alexander began asking the woman about his wife's health. Andrea replied that Madame had said she was feeling well and had gone straight to bed, but Renee had not had any supper. The housekeeper suspected that Renee had not eaten at all today. The lady was not one to constantly complain, and her health was causing Andre concern. Seeing how quickly Alexander ran into his wife's room, Andrea was touched and decided that she had nothing to worry about here. Alexander opened the door to the bedroom he shared with Renee. The room was silent. A nightlight was burning in the very corner, and Renee was snoring peacefully, covered with a blanket. Alex tiptoed closer to the bed and looked closely at Renee, the man's attentive eyes examining every inch of her body. The girl was fast asleep. probably without dreams, since even her eyelids did not tremble. Alexander sighed with relief. Little Svenushka always made him worry. The girl did not move. Only measured breathing could be heard from her side of the huge bed. Alexander was about to go wash up and go to bed too, but suddenly his gaze fell on Renee's legs, which at that moment were sticking out from under the blanket. The sight of her feet shocked him. They were all covered in calluses and abrasions. For Alex, it was unacceptable that his wife should suffer like that. The man carefully examined Renee's feet, acting very carefully, trying not to wake his wife. Alexander was upset. Why did Renee tell everyone that her legs weren't worth attention? She should have asked them to treat them with medicine. Of course, this woman is unpredictable. Alex was annoyed that Renee was so careless about herself. The man went to get the first aid kit and bandages. He carefully applied the ointment and gently bandaged Renee's legs. Alexander's hands moved very carefully. The war experience was taking its toll, but fortunately, Renee didn't feel anything at all. Alex felt sorry for Renee. She must have been in a lot of pain. Apparently, she had been running barefoot for some time. Judging by the time of the attack, Renee was near the company office at the same time as Alex, so the man blamed himself for not seeing his wife, and that's why she got hurt. Alex scolded himself for being rude to Renee last night. His kiss had been very rough. He tied her to himself from the very beginning. If he hadn't done that, Renee wouldn't have received these wounds now. Alexander finished treating his wife's injured feet and straightened up. Now he could calm down a little. Suddenly, he heard a quiet whisper. Renee was saying something in her sleep, but it was not very clear and it was difficult to make out. Alexander leaned closer to the girl and listened. Renee was calling him by name. She was complaining that she was in pain. The man thought that Renee was waking up because he had tightly bandaged her and wanted to correct his work. At this time, Renee whispered that she hated him. Alex realized that she was talking in her sleep, and his heart sank into emptiness. What he just heard could very well be true. Renee hates him, and what else could he expect after these 2 years of shared torment? Alexander sank helplessly onto the bed. He was very sorry that their relationship had reached a dead end, but he had only himself to blame for this. Morning came. One of Renee's favorites was sleeping peacefully on a chair in her mistress's room. The cat perked up and sat up. She heard that her owner was about to get up, which meant she could count on treats. Renee woke up and stretched in bed. Today would again be full of problems, just like all the previous ones. Renee saw the kitten and asked how he slept last night. The mice didn't bother him. The kitten climbed onto the bed and then into Renee's arms, willingly allowed himself to be petted and licked his owner on the cheek. Renee was fiddling with the kitten and suddenly noticed that her legs had been treated and bandaged by someone. She herself hadn't had the strength to do this yesterday. The bandages were applied carefully and gently. The girl wondered who could have done this. She did not admit to anyone that she was injured. The girl looked at the feet for a long time and reasoned that none of the servants would do this. Renee thought that it could only be Alexander, and guessed that yesterday he had not seen a dream. He had actually come. At that very moment, the door opened, and the butler rolled a wheelchair into the room. Renee greeted Gabriel and asked what it was, and why he had brought her here. Gabriel replied that Monsieur Alexandre had given orders to bring Madame Renee a wheelchair, as her injuries would make it difficult for her to move around. I was really surprised, Renee. That was all I needed. She immediately became indignant. Butler Gabriel conveyed Alexander's wishes to Renee that she use this chair until her leg wounds were completely healed. The girl objected. This was too much. Yesterday she had calmly walked home, and nothing would happen to her today. Butler Gabriel replied that Monsieur Alexandre had asked him to take care of Renee before leaving for the office. He had asked, not ordered. Renee grumbled. If he was so worried, he could have come to her in the morning and talked. She wouldn't have been against it. Gabriel reached into his coat pocket and said that Monsieur Alexandre had asked him to convey one important thing to Madame Renee. The butler handed Renee a jar of candies and relayed Alex's words that they would help her calm her mind and body. They were orange, just like Renee liked them. Renee thought it was very sweet. She gave him exactly the same candies, only whiskey-flavored, just like he liked them. The girl held Alex's gift in her hands and thought that everything would have been wonderful if not for those words of his. He said that they were not the same as before, and that what happened in the past did not matter, asking if it was really that important to Renee. The girl's thoughts were again confused about what he wanted from her. Renee put the jar on the bed and told the butler that she would stay in the room until she was completely recovered. Gabriel replied that it was a good idea, but he would leave the stroller in her room for now in case she needed it. Renee handed the butler a letter and asked him to pass it on to Alexander's grandmother. It was a message from the Queen that had made her so nervous yesterday. The butler promised to deliver it immediately and warned that food would be brought to Renee's room so that she could rest peacefully. The girl was left alone in the room, thoughtfully holding in her hands a jar of sweets given to her by Alexander. Of course, it's not recommended to eat sweets before breakfast. Renee smiled. But if you really want it, you can. The girl took out one small fragrant ball and put it in her mouth with anticipation of pleasure. I remembered that he first said that he would always be on her side, then that she should not kiss anyone else except him, and then that she should not look for him anymore. His words that she was boring him and that she was an object and should behave accordingly hit him hard, and the candy fell out of her hands. Renee sat up in bed, her wedding portrait with Alex right in front of her, but she had had enough. She didn't want to live under this guy's influence anymore. A completely different house and a completely different door, on which a loud but timid knock was heard. Rose entered the room. The woman who was in the room greeted her. She had been languishing here in anticipation for a long time. Rose came to Nina, who had to wait for her for too long, and Alex's stepsister's patience was running out. Nina reported that despite Rose's whining, Nina personally brought her the key, and she was now interested in what she would give her in return. The girl asked whether she would pay for her mother's treatment if she gave Nina what she had brought. Nina replied that everything depended on what exactly Rosa brought her. Nina wasn't going to just throw money away. Nina sat in front of the maid, calm and confident, but in fact she was very nervous. Much in her life depended on what Rosa brought her. The maid was confident that the papers she brought would be useful to her mistress. Rosa handed Nina the folder, with papers that she had previously kept behind her back. Nina took the folder and delved into studying its contents. Sorting through the papers, Nina became more and more surprised. This was exactly what she needed. Nina couldn't believe her eyes. Luck had finally smiled on her. The girl began to laugh madly, so much so that Rosa was even afraid that Madame Nina had gone mad with joy. Nina said that Rose did a great job and deserved her reward. The girl looked at Nina with hope. Now this woman had to pay for her mother's treatment. Nina was actually very pleased. Rosa had done her an invaluable service, and now the girl had a very important trump card in her hands. Nina got hold of the original contract between Renee and Alexander, and now she was going to use it in the fight for a place in the sun named Chambler and Company. Alexander gave another press conference. He said that the winners and losers in the last war were determined by airplanes and motorcycles. It was then that he realized what his nation needed to become powerful and invincible. The country's future lay in the aviation and automobile industries. Newspapers were full of headlines. Following a series of premium cars, the Chambler Company is going to release a car affordable to everyone on the market. The car has become a sales sensation, with hundreds of thousands of pre-orders already received even before its release. The car will be unveiled at the capital's annual auto show. The big news is the support of the royal family, with Queen Mary declaring the automotive industry a new generation industry for Levert. There was also some negativity, with people writing and talking about the danger the car poses to the lives of pedestrians, drivers, and passengers. Families who lost loved ones in car accidents protested daily against cars and their proliferation on the roads of the Kingdom of Leverta. Alexander's personal physician, Dr. Lupez, arrived directly at the patient's office, warning that Alexander needed to rest more and pay attention to his health. If he continues to treat himself with such disdain and constantly burn out at work, he may indeed die in the prime of life. The doctor was pleased that Alexander had given up drinking and smoking after the last incident, but it was meaningless if he hadn't slept for days on end. Alexander promised the doctor that he would be more attentive, but he was more concerned about his wife's health. Renee's legs worried him more than his own heart. When Alexander spoke about Renee with the doctor, he showed maximum attention, and now he was all ears. Dr. Lupus replied that his wife was perfectly healthy, and that providing her with a wheelchair to move around in was too much on his part. In fact, Renee asked the doctor to visit Alexander every other day, as she was very concerned about his health. Alex didn't expect Renee to care about him so much. Unexpectedly, pleasantly, and somehow strangely, while he behaves with her like an absolute idiot. Dr. Lupus checked his patient's headache pills and told him it was time for him to go. On the way out, Lupez remarked that if Alex didn't plan to leave his wife a widow, he should stop acting recklessly and think more about himself. The doctor left. Alexander was left alone in the office. A rare moment of peace and quiet arose, and as always at this time, various thoughts crept into his head. Alexander twirled the bottle of pills in his hands. His head didn't hurt yet, and he didn't see the point in taking this medicine. His hand habitually reached for the cigar box. For a while they had brought him some, if not physical, then moral comfort. This box no longer contained cigars. It contained candies, and their supply was constantly replenished by the secretary, on Renee's orders, and with Alex's tacit consent. The small sweet ball went into the mouth. The pleasant taste not only brought pleasure, but also gave strength. Alexander asked himself when it happened that he stopped reaching for the headache pills that he used to take out of habit, and what happened to him that he stopped refilling his cigar supply after Renee threw them out. The bottle of his favorite whiskey had been gathering dust in the cupboard for a long time, and Alexander had no desire to open it. The owner of a large automobile company wondered what was really happening to him, and whether he was really beginning to believe in the possibility of happiness. Renee, it's all her. She has such a hypnotic effect on him, or rather her words that if he wants to drink or smoke, he should eat one of these candies. How beautiful and desirable she is, this hair, eyes, and hands. Alexander was ready to admire them forever. The whole world, including himself, had to lie at the feet of this woman, because Alexander had never met anyone better than her in the world. Renee's kiss was the most desirable reward of the occasion for Alex. If he could, he would never let go of her lips. But what he was actually doing was that Alexander was constantly pushing Renee away from him, saying harsh and caustic words to her. But it was necessary. He destroyed their mutual feelings with his own hands, wiping everything into dust, convincing himself that he was doing the right thing. Suddenly, he remembered how Renee told him that she had kissed more than just him, and a feeling of jealousy awakened in Alexander. Who did she kiss? Who dared to touch his woman? Alex got angry. Anger at the unknown rival squeezed his throat. His fingers squeezed the arm of the chair so hard that it creaked, which brought Alexander back to reality. What a fool he is, and what right does he have to think about this if he doesn't plan to connect his life with this woman? Alexander was the first to push away her gentle hand, and constantly demonstrates his coldness and disdainful attitude. Their first meeting after many years of separation was cold, and this was, first and foremost, Alexander's fault. Renee then asked if he really wanted to see her. Alexander could not deny it. He hoped that Renee would not forget him in her beautiful Whitehall. Alexander sighed. Was this thought still sitting in his head? But there was very little time left. Very soon, he would stop tormenting her. Renee decided to take a little break and invigorate herself with a cup of aromatic tea. She finally went back to work after that incident with the pickpocket. Of course, she didn't want to return to work after a 3-day forced rest, but business required her presence. Renee was glad to have Dorothy, who was as devoted to their company as to her own, and the girl had even more energy. Dorothy was incredibly happy with the news that they were offered to open a department store in the neighboring country of Philips. This was a great expansion of their soap abroad. Dorothy was devastated when she learned of Renee's case, but she returned to work within 3 days, and with such incredible news. Dorothy had no time to waste. She immediately set about inventorying and supplying the new department store. Renee tried to calm her down, but Dorothy had already run off to the warehouse, and Renee had left behind documents for her to read and sign. Renee prepared to study the piles of accumulated papers, and thought to herself that she was very lucky with Dorothy. She was simply a wonderful employee. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Without waiting for permission, Nina entered Renee's office and noticed that Renee was having a good time. Renee didn't expect to see this woman in her office and asked in surprise what brought her to her office. Nina replied that Renee had settled in well. A provincial girl with an office in the capital, in a prestigious area, opened with other people's money. That was great news. Nina stated that Renee has no conscience or honor at all. Only Nina knows this, but very soon it will become known to the whole public. Renee firmly and politely repeated her question about why Nina had come to her office and what she wanted. Nina replied that she was curious to see what Renee was spending Alexander's money on, and that was that company, and that was all Renee was capable of. A sad sight. Renee replied that Nina was speaking rudely to her, but she clearly remembered asking her to be more polite to her and those around her. Nina smirked and said only 2 words: marriage contract. She expected Renee's face to change, and she would become confused. But that didn't happen. Then Nina showed Renee a folder with papers and said sarcastically that now she knew why Alexander chose Renee. Nina solemnly shook a folder of papers in Renee's face, but for some reason this did not make the desired impression on the girl. However, Nina continued to insist that Renee dared to consider herself the mistress of the Chambler house by signing such a contract. What does Renee think will happen to her and her reputation if Nina makes these papers public? The Chambler firm is at its peak now, and the news will spread instantly. How would Renee like a headline like this? Kaliva's Cinderella sold herself to a car magnate for money? Nina asked. 2 years ago, a maid informed Nina that the Queen had arranged another meeting between the Marquis of Chambler and Lady Cassis. Nina was outraged. She was aware of the Queen's matrimonial plans, but she hoped that the Marquise would not follow Her Highness's lead. The maid reassured her mistress that, of course, the Marquis had refused to meet the Queen's niece. He had completely different plans for his life. Nina was worried that the Queen had recently been trying hard to bring Alexander together with her granddaughter and must be trying to become his business partner. Nina was sure that if Alex had simply taken her with him to banquets and balls at the royal palace, His Majesty would have left him alone. They reported that the Marquise had returned. Nina, delighted by Alexander's appearance, jumped up and quickly ran to meet him. Nina rushed quickly down the corridor and dreamed that now she would ask Alex to take her with him to the reception. He must have already been tired of the Queen's pressure. Nina came down the stairs in a great mood. She greeted Alex and asked if he was tired today, but then her gaze stopped on Alexander's companion. Next to the object of her desire stood a young and very beautiful girl. Alexander rather frivolously hugged this woman by the shoulder. The whole appearance of this couple indicated that they were not strangers to each other. Nina looked into the girl's eyes and realized that she not only had a rival for Alex, but even then she felt that she was losing. Nina stopped dead in her tracks and asked in a sharp voice, addressing only Alexander, who this woman was. The answer didn't surprise Nina at all. She had predicted it, but it didn't make her feel any better. This scumbag became Alexander's wife, and when did she manage to do it? This was Nina's place. At least that's what she had long believed. No one dared to take it. But this Cinderella from Kaliva dared. Alexander always looked at her with such a penetrating and tender gaze, but Nina was sure that this was unfair, and that he should only look at her like that. At the wedding ceremony, watching the newlyweds kiss, Nina wondered about the reason for the marriage. There was no way Alex could fall in love with this woman. The contract that fell into Nina's hands made everything clear to her. She was sure that Alexander could not love anyone but her. Nina learned that the contract was for 2 years, and that in exchange for Renee becoming Alex's wife, he would sponsor her shelter and pay alimony after the divorce. Most likely, Renee took advantage of the fact that Alexander was tired of the Queen's pressure, and this thief snuck up on him like a hyena and grabbed the Chambler family's money. She also managed to kick Nina out of the mansion, but now she will get rid of this woman and will again take her place next to Alexander. That's exactly what Nina thought when she showed Renee the stolen documents. Now Renee Hazelin must leave the Chambler mansion. Nina accused Renee of marrying for money, and that she should have just quietly used the money, but she dared to act like the mistress of the house. Did Renee really think that if she was called a lady, then that was what she was? Was it in vain that she took on so much? Nina screamed that Renee was a fraud, and if she did not leave the Chambler family mansion immediately, Nina would report her actions to the Queen. Renee listened attentively to her guest's tirade and asked what kind of nonsense she was talking about and on what basis she had made all this up. Nina flared up. Did Renee not understand the situation she was in? The whole country believed in the love of Renee and Alex. Does Renee really think that the Queen, who tried to marry Alexander to her granddaughter, will leave Renee's actions unpunished after learning about it? Nina was sure that everyone would talk about Renee as a corrupt woman with very large fees. Everyone will despise Renee, and her reputation will be destroyed. which means both her company and her shelter will cease to exist. Nina asked if Renee really didn't care if the newspapers would pay Nina more money for this information if the public learned about this contract. Renee calmly took the folder of documents from Nina's hands and said that she wanted to see for herself the existence of the document that Nina was talking about so emotionally here. The coveted folder migrated into Renee's hands. Nina let go of the documents from her fingers, already sensing that there was a catch. Renee opened the folder and rummaged through its contents. There was no marriage contract here, she declared. Nina had made a big mistake. Instead, Renee showed Nina a completely different document. It was a marriage certificate between Alexander Chambler and Renee Chambler. Renee asked if Nina had decided to write novels and was promoting her new opus to her, or how she should understand everything she had heard. Nina grabbed the marriage certificate from Renee's hands. It was the first time she had seen this document. But how did it end up in her folder? Nina couldn't believe her eyes. But in front of her was an official document on stamped paper with watermarks and the imperial seal. The girl screamed hysterically that Renee had changed the documents, but Nina couldn't figure out how she had done it. Renee praised her enemy. Nina was well prepared and pulled off a very clever move with a pickpocket attack and theft of the key. But Renee isn't stupid either. She discovered that the key to the safe was missing from her purse, but the money was still there. This fact was strange. Who in their right mind and sound memory would steal a key unknown to them? Only the one who needs it. Renee didn't have to think long about who the perpetrator was. There was only one option. Nina was planning another setup. The girl ordered the housekeeper to immediately find the maid Rosa, whom they suspected of having an affair with Nina. The search did not take long. Rose was not fired from the mansion after the previous incident and was found in her room doing something completely predictable. At this time, Rosa was packing her suitcases. She knew that she would soon be exposed, and therefore she was going to leave Kaliva as quickly as possible. Renee herself came to the maid's room and asked where she was going at such a late hour. Rose was in shock, so when asked if she had stolen the key to her safe, she answered in the affirmative. Renee felt sorry for this sweet and diligent girl, so she decided it would be better to find out everything herself. The maid fell at Renee's feet and burst into tears. She would never have gone against her mistress if it had not been for the circumstances. Renee advised Rose to tell her the truth today and now, unless, of course, she intended to answer for other people's crimes. Rosa could have been blamed for hiring the thief and for the jewelry theft that Melinda had committed. Rosa must tell the truth. She stole the documents from Renee and sold them to Nina. Rose begged the lady to have pity on her. Nina threatened to throw her out of the mansion with a black mark, and the girl's mother was seriously ill. Nina was quite capable of carrying out her threat, and then Rose would have nothing to pay for her mother's treatment. Rosa asked to be forgiven, not to be deprived of her job and a piece of bread. She did this not for profit and not for herself personally. Except for her mother, she simply had no one else. Renee, like no one else, understood Rose's concern for her sick mother. She will never forget how her father, and then her grandfather, passed away. Renee will never forget his childhood despair. Her father asked her for forgiveness for leaving her so early. Renee sobbed and begged her father, no matter what he was dying, as if it were in her power to stop. Neither the little girl nor her father could postpone the separation. Renee felt compassion for the maid and decided that she would give her another chance. Now Rose would help her and stop Nina from harming her. Rose promised that she would fulfill any order of the mistress, in order to be forgiven and allowed to work. She was even ready to kill. Renee reassured the girl that it wouldn't come to that. She should just go to Nina for another payment and replace the documents at the right moment. Renee promised that if Rose completed this task successfully, she would not only forgive her and leave her in the mansion, but also pay for her mother's treatment. Now Nina and Renee stood face to face. Cinderella of Calem clearly outplayed her evil sister. Her overconfidence and lack of attention to detail let her down. Renee told Nina that she had been betrayed by the same man who had previously betrayed Renee. And what should they both do now? Besides, Renee had another piece of news. Rose had moved far away from here with her mother, and thanks to Nina's money, she was able to send her mother to a good hospital. In Nina's hands was a certificate from the Bran Marquise of Chambler and Baroness Hazen, married Chambler. What Nina was now planning to do was of interest to Renee. Renee settled herself more comfortably and prepared to listen once again to all of Nina's complaints and plans.